There is a particular silence that only winter snow can create. It is not the absence of sound, but rather a dampening, a gentle pressing down of all noise, as if the earth itself has drawn a thick blanket over everything that dares to move or speak. Imagine yourself standing now in a forest of tall, dark pines somewhere in the northern reaches of what was once Imperial Russia, in a place where the landscape rolls in gentle forested hills beneath a sky so clear and so cold that the stars seem to press downward with their own weight. The snow lies deep around your feet, perhaps 3 or 4 feet in places where the wind has gathered it into drifts, and the crystals beneath your boots make almost no sound at all as you shift your weight. There is only the faintest whisper, a quiet crunching so muted that you have to listen very carefully to hear it at all. The date is sometime in the middle of winter, January or February of 1942. The night is so dark that distances become meaningless. 100 meters away might as well be 1,000. The trees emerge from the blackness like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with accumulated frost and ice, and if you were standing there, you would notice that the air itself seems to have a texture, a crystalline quality that catches in your throat as you breathe. The temperature, at this particular moment, is somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees below zero in Fahrenheit, though it may be colder. No one is keeping precise measurements anymore. Thermometers have become less important than the simple fact that human fingers stop responding to commands, that boots no longer bend the way they are meant to bend, that the simple act of thinking becomes difficult when your core body temperature begins to slip. But you are not alone in this forest. There are men here, thousands of them, though you cannot see them. They are sheltered, if the word can even be used, in hastily dug trenches and in makeshift dugouts carved into the frozen earth. Some are huddled in small wooden structures that they have constructed from whatever timber they could find, and others are simply lying in the snow, their bodies layered with blankets and whatever else could be gathered to hold the warmth that is slowly, relentlessly leaving them. Their breath, if they are still breathing, rises invisibly into the black air and disappears. The exhaustion is so complete that many of them are asleep, though sleep in these conditions is a peculiar thing. It is less rest and more a surrendering of consciousness to the cold itself. And then, from somewhere in the distance, perhaps several kilometers away, perhaps farther, it is difficult to judge in the dark, there is a sound. It is not loud, but it is distinct. It is the sound of artillery, a distant thump, followed by the rumble of impact somewhere beyond the visible world. Then silence again, then another distant concussion. These sounds roll across the frozen landscape at irregular intervals, never quite loud enough to be immediately threatening, but present enough to remind the men in the snow that they are not alone, and not safe, and not going anywhere. This is the world of the Demyansk pocket in the winter of 1942, a place that few people have heard of, a corner of the Eastern Front where the vast machinery of the Second World War ground itself against cold, starvation, and human will. It is a story that has been largely forgotten in popular memory, overshadowed by the more famous catastrophes that would follow. Yet, it is a story worth knowing, worth understanding in its full detail and complexity. If you are drawn to these quieter chapters of history, to the human dimensions of military disaster and survival, to the strange alchemy of courage and cruelty that defines the fighting fronts of the Second World War, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We explore the lesser-known sieges, the forgotten pockets of resistance and encirclement, the moments when massive armies found themselves caught in circumstances beyond their control, and the individuals who lived through them. We move slowly through these stories, unrushed, with care for both the facts and the human reality beneath them. For now, though, let us remain in this frozen forest a little longer. Let us understand what brought these men here, to this particular stretch of Russian winter, in this particular moment in history. Let us understand what division they belonged to, what choices had led them to dig holes in the ground beneath the snow, and what would unfold in the weeks that followed. The story begins not here, in the snow, but rather in a different place and time, in the origins of a military unit that would play a role in some of the war's darkest chapters. The forest around us is quiet again now. The artillery has ceased for the moment. There is only the wind, moving softly through the branches of the pines, and the faint shifting of snow, and the breathing of thousands of men who are waiting for dawn, or for relief, or perhaps simply waiting for whatever comes next. In the distance, somewhere beyond the darkness, the war continues. Here, in this small pocket of winter silence, time seems to move differently. It moves in the measured rhythm of survival. It moves in the temperature of the air, in the depth of the snow, in the slow depletion of whatever food and ammunition remains. And it will move this way for weeks yet, in a siege that few had expected, in a trap that would define an entire generation's understanding of what it meant to be surrounded, to be cut off, and to endure. The Valdai Hills rise in northwestern Russia like a sleeping giant beneath the snow, their slopes gentle and ancient, worn smooth by time itself. They sit between two great bodies of water, Lake Ilmen to the north, and the vast expanse of lakes and marshes that feed toward the Baltic and beyond. It is country of soft transitions, where forest and water blur into one another, where the horizon seems always slightly indistinct, as if the land itself is not quite certain where it ends and the sky begins. In summer, this region breathes with birch forests and the sounds of small villages. In winter, particularly the winter of 1942, it becomes something else entirely, a landscape of silence so complete it seems almost alive. To understand why a frozen forest near a village called Demyansk mattered to the larger rhythm of the Second World War, we must step back for a moment and consider the strange geometry of conflict that had developed by early 1942 on the Eastern Front. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had begun in June of the previous year with staggering momentum. German armies had advanced hundreds of kilometers in mere months, and the conventional wisdom among Hitler and his generals held that the Soviet Union could be defeated before winter arrived. But winter did arrive, as it always does in Russia, and the German advance, though formidable, had begun to lose its initial velocity. The front lines by January 1942 stretched across a vast distance, thousands of kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and Germany's Army Group North, under the command of Georg von Lieb, found itself positioned in this northwestern sector, trying to hold and expand its grip on territory that included the Valdai Hills and the regions around Lake Ilmen. The strategic thinking behind German operations in this sector was rooted in the broader objective of encircling and destroying Soviet forces before they could recover from the shock of invasion. Army Group North had advanced toward Leningrad with the intention of either capturing the city or starving it into submission. But the Soviets had not obliged by collapsing as quickly as German planners had anticipated. Instead, as autumn turned to winter, the Red Army began to gather strength. New divisions arrived from the Soviet Far East, forces that Stalin had kept watchful and ready in case Japan turned westward. These fresh reserves gave Soviet commanders the capacity to contemplate something that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier, a counterattack. Not a desperate, localized thrust, but a coordinated winter offensive designed to drive wedges between German army groups and trap large German forces in isolated pockets. The Valdai Hills and the region around Demyansk occupied a particularly vulnerable position in this strategic landscape. Here, Army Group North's line was relatively thin, stretched across difficult terrain, where supply lines ran through narrow corridors of forest and frozen ground. The German 16th Army, commanded by Adolf Strauss, held this sector. His forces were tired from months of advance and combat, their strength diluted by the demands of occupying and pacifying newly conquered territory. When the Soviet winter counteroffensive began in January 1942, it was precisely in this kind of location, where the German line was most extended, most exhausted, that Soviet commanders chose to strike. They had learned, through bitter experience over the previous months, that frontal assaults against well-prepared German positions were costly and often futile. Instead, they chose to punch through weak points, to encircle rather than confront directly, and to use the winter landscape itself as a weapon. The terrain around Demyansk made it both a logical target for encirclement and a place where a trapped force might be supplied by air, at least theoretically. The open ground near frozen lakes and marshes meant that aircraft could land if conditions permitted. The forests provided wood for fires and some shelter, however inadequate against temperatures that would fall to levels few soldiers had previously experienced. The very emptiness and silence of this landscape, its apparent emptiness at least to those unfamiliar with it, masked the reality that this was not truly empty at all. Soviet forces were present in the forests and villages, moving in the snow with a familiarity born of generations of living in such country. The Germans were the outsiders here, the invaders, pushing into terrain and climate that was alien to most of them, fighting a war on ground that did not belong to them, in a season that seemed almost to conspire against their survival. It is worth pausing to consider what it meant for a military force to be stationed in such a place at such a time. The Valdai Hills in January are not hospitable to armies. The cold is profound, not the occasional bitter day, but weeks and months of sustained cold that freezes metal, that turns oil thick as glue, that makes exposed skin go numb within minutes. The snow accumulates steadily, transforming familiar roads into trackless wastes. Supply lines that seemed adequate in summer become tenuous threads when trucks must laboriously navigate frozen highways, and every vehicle becomes another target for Soviet air attack or partisan ambush. For soldiers accustomed to the relative mildness of Western Europe, or even to the autumn campaigns of 1941, this represented a test of not only physical endurance, but of psychological resilience as well. The vast majority of the German soldiers in this sector had never experienced anything like it. Lake Ilmen itself serves as a kind of geographical marker for this chapter of the war. Roughly 100 kilometers long and narrower in width, it sits like a great shield of ice once winter locks it solid. Around its shores and in the hills beyond, the villages were small and scattered, places like Demyansk, Staraya Russa, and countless others whose names appeared on maps and in military reports, but meant little to most of the world outside the context of this campaign. What made these locations important was their position on supply and communication routes. Demyansk in particular sat along the road that connected German positions, and more importantly, it became central to the strategic calculations of both German and Soviet commanders. It was not a city of great industrial importance or symbolic significance. It was important simply because armies were there, because survival itself became dependent on holding certain ground in this silent, snow-covered landscape. The Soviet winter counteroffensive, which unfolded across multiple sectors of the front in those early months of 1942, represented a profound shift in the war's trajectory. For the first time since Barbarossa began, German forces were not advancing. They were being pushed backward, or in some cases, surrounded. The initiative, which Germany had held so completely in the opening months of invasion, was beginning to slip from German hands. The Valdai Hills and the region around Demyansk became one of the first places where this shift became tangible, where German soldiers could feel the weight of encirclement closing around them like winter itself, implacable, inexorable, and terrifyingly real. The quiet forests and frozen lakes that had seemed merely remote and inhospitable were about to become the setting for one of the war's first major crises of German mobile operations on the Eastern Front. Most of the great winter battles of the Second World War have been told and retold until their shape has worn smooth in the popular imagination. Stalingrad, the Ardennes, the breaking of the siege at Leningrad. But there remains a smaller, quieter story, one that unfolded across the same frozen landscape and in many ways set the pattern for everything that would follow, a story that deserves to be known with the kind of patience and attention that allows all its details to emerge slowly, like figures materializing through falling snow. The Demyansk pocket, as it came to be called, was neither the largest nor the bloodiest of the encirclements that scarred the Eastern Front, and yet it was perhaps the most consequential, the first of its kind, the moment when an army trapped in the snow discovered that it could theoretically be kept alive from the air, a discovery that would echo forward with terrible consequences. Why is it that some histories fade while others endure? Often it is simply a matter of scale, of numbers, of the spectacular nature of a catastrophe. But the siege of Demyansk has another quality. It is a story of threshold, of a moment when the war shifted subtly on its axis, when German strategists learned a lesson they would teach themselves again, with even more disastrous results, when men discovered what the human body could survive and what it could not, when the snow kept its silence over a landscape where tens of thousands of soldiers faced an uncertainty they had never quite imagined before that winter closed around them. If you find yourself drawn to the lesser-known corridors of military history, to the stories that shape the greater catastrophes, to the precise moment when theories met reality in the frozen earth of the Eastern Front, I would invite you to follow along as this documentary unfolds the full chronicle of what happened at Demyansk, not in the compressed, urgent way that history is often taught, but slowly, with time to absorb each layer, each decision, each consequence. We will move through the formation of the division that became trapped there, trace how it came to be in that place at that moment, understand the strategic circumstances that created the encirclement, feel the weight of the cold and hunger that defined survival within the pocket, witness the desperate measures taken by both Germans and Soviets in the months that followed, and consider at length what this siege meant, not only for those who endured it, but for the entire trajectory of the war that still had years to run. Subscribe if stories of this texture call to you, if you prefer to understand history not as a sequence of dramatic moments, but as a landscape you can walk through at your own pace, absorbing the texture of each day, each decision, each small human act against the vast indifference of winter. There is something particular about the way that a lesser-known siege yields its secrets. Because fewer eyes have been fixed upon it, fewer simple narratives have calcified around it. The letters and accounts and military reports remain closer to their original state, less polished by decades of retelling. We have access to voices that were not immediately conscripted into propaganda, to observations made by men who did not know yet what they would be remembered for. This is the kind of history that rewards patience, a slow accumulation of details that eventually add up not to a single dramatic revelation, but to a gradual, deepening understanding of what it meant to be alive in that pocket, to be part of a division that would become legendary, not for triumph, but for endurance, for the simple, terrible fact of survival under conditions that seemed to demand death. The story of the Totenkopf Division at Demyansk is a story of that kind, one that has been somewhat overshadowed by the larger tragedies that followed, and yet contains within itself the seeds of everything that came after, the moment when an army learned it could breathe through a tube of air instead of dying in isolation, a moment that would reshape the possibilities and the catastrophes of the Eastern Front before the first thaw had even broken the ice. Let us move now into that world, that frozen landscape, that pocket sealed in snow, and discover what happened there and why it still matters, why it still commands our attention across the decades that separate us from that winter of 1942. The story of how the Totenkopf Division came to exist, how it was born, shaped, and transformed, begins not on a battlefield, but behind barbed wire, in the administrative chambers of the Nazi terror apparatus. In the early 1930s, when the Third Reich was consolidating power and constructing its machinery of control, Theodor Eicke was a man searching for a purpose within the new order. He was a former soldier of modest rank, a man of rigid thinking, absolutely devoted to hierarchy and obedience. And in 1934, he found his calling as the commandant of Dachau, the first concentration camp. There, in that role, Eicke began to organize something unprecedented, a permanent, dedicated unit of guards whose sole function was the administration of Nazi imprisonment and terror. These were not mere jailers, they were ideologues with uniforms, men selected and trained to believe that their work was essential to the protection of the German nation from what Nazi propaganda called racial and political enemies. By 1935, Eicke had formalized this into what he called the SS Verfügungstruppe, the SS Disposal Troops, a reserve force that answered directly to the SS leadership, not to the regular army. These men came from concentration camp guard details across the Reich. Many had been shaped, even corrupted, by their years managing prisoners in conditions of deliberate degradation. They had grown accustomed to violence as routine, to suffering as something distant and abstract when inflicted on others. They carried with them the mentality of the camps, absolute authority, unquestioned obedience, and a kind of moral numbness that repeated cruelty can produce. Ike hand-selected officers and trained them rigorously in a doctrine that blended military discipline with the ideological fanaticism he had cultivated in the camps. The unit was small at first, perhaps 3,000 men, but it represented something new in European warfare, a paramilitary force designed from its inception to embody not just military efficiency, but Nazi racial ideology as living practice. The transformation from camp guard unit to full combat division took time and opportunity. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the SS Verfügungstruppe was reorganized and expanded. Eicke's authority over it grew. The unit participated in the Polish campaign as an independent formation, fighting alongside regular army units and proving itself capable of aggressive action. Then came the fall of France in 1940. The unit, now called the SS Totenkopf Division, the Death's Head Division, a name drawn from its collar insignia, fought in the campaign against the Low Countries and France with notable ferocity. Eicke, now a divisional commander with the rank of Brigade Führer, earned a reputation as a bold and ruthless tactician, willing to accept heavy casualties for rapid advancement. His men displayed the kind of absolute commitment to orders and aggression that marked the most ideologically committed SS formations. This was Eicke's moment of triumph. The man who had run concentration camps was now a general commanding thousands of men in conventional warfare. Yet the character of his command, the methods he had learned and perfected in the camps, never truly left him. His soldiers were SS men, selected partly for racial criteria, partly for ideological reliability. They were taught that they represented a racial and military elite, that their struggle was not merely for territory, but for the survival of their racial community. Songs and speeches filled their minds with this language of destiny and struggle. Many were young, ideologically molded from youth organizations into absolute believers in the Nazi vision. Others were true believers, men for whom the ideology had penetrated deeply enough to shape their sense of self and purpose. What emerged was a curious formation, a regular army division in structure and organization, yet one infused with the fanaticism of the camps, the ruthlessness of the SS hierarchy, and the ideology of racial war. It was not an ordinary military unit. It retained its own SS insignia, its own command structure independent of army authority, its own supply and promotion chains. Eicke answered to Himmler and the SS leadership as much as to the military hierarchy. This created tensions and conflicts, particularly with the conservative officer corps of the regular army, who viewed these SS formations with a mixture of respect for their fighting ability and contempt for their political ideology. Yet the SS divisions proved effective, and so they were tolerated, supported, and eventually expanded. The journey of the Totenkopf Division, from the watchtowers and administrative blocks of Dachau to the frozen forests near Demyansk, is in this sense a logical one, though the distances travelled were vast. Everything Theodor Eicke had learned about control, about extracting absolute obedience, about maintaining discipline through a combination of ideology and terror, all of it would be brought to bear when the division found itself enclosed in snow, surrounded by enemies, dependent on his will and judgment for survival. The very qualities that had made him an effective camp commandant would be tested on a winter battlefield where the enemy was not defenseless prisoners, but trained Soviet soldiers fighting for their own survival. Eicke's rigidity, his ideological certainty, his willingness to demand sacrifice, his ability to motivate men through fear and fervent belief, these would all be central to what was about to unfold in the weeks ahead. The men who formed the division at this moment in early 1942, as they moved eastward into the freezing landscape, carried with them the weight of that history. They did not know it yet, but they were about to face a test unlike anything they had experienced. The camps had taught their commanders how to rule through absolute authority. The campaigns in France had shown them they could prevail through aggressive tactics and ideological commitment. But the Russian winter would teach them something else entirely, something about the limits of will, about the cost of isolation, about the difference between terrorizing captive populations and fighting an enemy willing and capable of fighting back with equal desperation. The Totenkopf Division that would find itself frozen in the Valdai Hills had already earned a reputation, and understanding that reputation requires us to step backward through the fog of time to the years before Demyansk, when the division's character was still being forged in the crucible of conquest. Theodor Eicke, the man who had built this formation from the remnants of concentration camp guards and political enforcers, understood the instrument he had created, a unit bound not by the traditional military codes that governed the regular German army, but by an absolute, almost religious devotion to the ideology of National Socialism and to Hitler himself. The very bone and cartilage of the Totenkopf had been built in those camps, where obedience was not learned through drill and discipline alone, but through a kind of ideological intoxication that made cruelty and loyalty inseparable in the minds of these men. When the division first saw combat in France, in the spring of 1940, it was as a motorized unit, moving swiftly in the wake of German tanks and infantry, and what occurred there was neither entirely unexpected nor particularly noted by the wider world at the time. The rapidity of the French campaign meant that the Totenkopf encountered relatively little organized resistance in the areas where it operated. Yet, even in that brief span of weeks, reports emerged of unauthorized killings, of soldiers and civilians executed without trial or military necessity. These were not the isolated acts of individual zealots, but rather the logical extension of a unit's fundamental character, a formation whose men had been trained to see themselves as the vanguard of a racial and ideological struggle, not merely as soldiers fighting a conventional war. The distinction would matter, and it would become increasingly significant as the Totenkopf moved eastward. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was when the division truly began to establish the patterns and methods that would define it throughout the war. In the beginning, the momentum was overwhelming. German armies drove deep into Soviet territory with a speed that seemed almost impossible, and the Totenkopf was there in the spearhead, part of Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Lieb, pushing toward Leningrad along roads that grew progressively muddier and longer as summer turned toward autumn. The initial Soviet resistance was chaotic. Entire armies were surrounded and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured or killed, and there seemed, for a brief and intoxicating moment, to be a genuine possibility that the Soviet Union might collapse within months, that Moscow might fall, that Hitler's grand vision of conquest might actually be achieved. But beneath the surface of these German victories, something else was taking root, a pattern of behavior that was becoming more deliberate and more systematic with each passing week. Soviet soldiers who surrendered to the Totenkopf faced an uncertain fate, and increasingly, that fate was determined not by military law or convention, but by the ideological convictions of their captors. Commissars, Soviet political officers whose role was to maintain discipline and morale, were singled out for execution, not as prisoners of war, but as enemies of a cosmic struggle, as representatives of a Bolshevism that Eicke and his men had been taught to regard as an existential threat to German civilization. Civilians in areas occupied by the Totenkopf lived under a different kind of terror than those who encountered regular Wehrmacht units. There was a deliberately cultivated brutality, a sense that the normal rules of occupation did not apply, that the Eastern Front was a theatre of absolute ideological warfare in which mercy was not merely weakness, but a betrayal of the cause. How does a unit develop such a character? The answer lies not in the war itself, but in the choices made by its leadership and the ideological climate in which those choices are made and accepted and even celebrated. As the campaign continued through the autumn of 1941, the Totenkopf's reputation grew, and it grew in a particular direction. The division gained recognition for its fanaticism, its willingness to hold positions that others might have abandoned. Its refusal to retreat, even when retreating, made tactical sense. These qualities earned it commendations from higher command, and they also earned it respect among other SS formations. Yet these same qualities, the rigid, almost religious dedication to Eicke's vision of what an SS soldier should be, also made the division uniquely vulnerable to the kind of ordeal that was approaching. A unit forged in the ideology of movement, of conquest, of rapid advance and total victory, was about to be trapped in immobility, in a pocket surrounded by enemies, in the deep cold of a Russian winter. The very strengths that had served the Totenkopf in the campaigns of France and the early Soviet invasion would soon become liabilities, spiritual and physical impediments to survival in a frozen landscape where ideological fervor could not warm frozen fingers or fill empty stomachs. The division had learned, over the previous 18 months, to see itself as the elite of the elite, as men whose dedication transcended the limitations of ordinary soldiers. They had learned to view their enemy not as fellow combatants worthy of respect, but as subhuman obstacles to be removed. They had learned that their commander, Theodor Eicke, would demand everything of them and would punish any sign of doubt or hesitation with a severity that left no room for argument. These lessons, absorbed so thoroughly that they had become almost instinctive, would now be tested in a way that neither Eicke nor his men could have fully anticipated. The Valdai Hills awaited. The snow awaited. The long night of encirclement awaited. But first, we must understand the precise moment when the encirclement occurred, when the opportunity for escape and withdrawal suddenly vanished, and when the Totenkopf Division became trapped, along with 5 other German formations, in a pocket that would demand everything they had learned and everything they still had to endure. By the opening weeks of 1942, the German armies pushing deep into the Soviet Union had begun to stretch like taffy pulled too thin across an impossibly vast landscape. Army Group North, under the command of Colonel General Georg von Lieb, had driven northeast from the Baltic toward the ancient city of Novgorod, seeking to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the region while cutting the Moscow-Leningrad supply line. The men believed they were on the threshold of victory, that one more push through the snow and the Soviets would collapse entirely. But the mathematics of conquest in Russia had never favored those who believed in quick victories. The terrain around Lake Ilmen and the Valdai Hills, that maze of frozen forests and half-buried villages we spoke of earlier, became the stage where overconfidence met the weight of geography. German supply lines now stretched backward through hundreds of kilometers of occupied territory, thinned across railways the Soviets had deliberately destroyed, and roads that were less roads than suggestions cut through white silence. Every truck carrying ammunition, food, or fuel had to travel farther than the last, and in temperatures that could freeze lubricating oil and crack engine blocks, the machines themselves became as vulnerable as the men who drove them. The Soviets, watching this extension with cold calculation, had begun concentrating their forces in the northern sectors. Through December 1941 and into the depths of January 1942, while the German High Command debated strategy in distant headquarters, Soviet General Andrei Semyon had assembled 2 shock armies, the 34th and the 11th, along with multiple cavalry and mechanized corps. The objective was not to retake Moscow or to defend the south, but rather to strike at Army Group North's weakest points and, if fortune permitted, to cut off and destroy the spearhead of the German advance entirely. It was a classical maneuver, the kind taught in every military academy. Find your enemy's extended limb and sever it. The pivot moment came in early January, as temperatures plunged to -20, -30 degrees Celsius, and the snow deepened across the landscape until it swallowed vehicles halfway up their sides. The Soviet offensive began. It was not a dramatic, frontal assault of the kind Westerners might imagine. Rather, It was a slow, methodical encirclement, a drawing in of forces from multiple directions, columns of Soviet infantry and tanks, moving through forests and across frozen marshes, taking positions piece by piece. The Germans, spread thin across their forward lines, had fewer reserves than they believed. Every division that moved to plug one gap created another elsewhere. By mid-January, the situation had become remarkably clear to those with eyes to see it. 6 German divisions, among them the 3rd SS Totenkopf Division, the Wehrmacht's 16th Army Corps units, Luftwaffe field divisions pressed into ground combat, found themselves increasingly isolated in a pocket southeast of Demyansk, a town of perhaps 2,000 souls that had suddenly become the center of the world. Around them, the Soviet forces continued their slow, patient constriction. The Germans had been cut off before, had escaped encirclements through determination and rapid counterattack. But this time something felt different. This time the Soviets showed no signs of weakness, and the winter showed no signs of ending. How had such a situation arisen so quickly? The answer lies partly in the German doctrine of mobile warfare, the belief that speed and aggression could overcome numerical disadvantages. But it also lies in something quieter, the assumption that the Soviets were finished, that they would collapse under the weight of repeated defeats. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses in 1941, it was true. Yet for every Soviet army group destroyed, another seemed to materialize from the frozen depths. The landscape itself had become an ally to the defense, and time, that most precious resource in war, had begun to flow in Soviet favor rather than German. The pocket, roughly circular, measured perhaps 60 kilometers across at its widest point. Within it lay not only soldiers, but the civilian population of occupied territory, horses, wounded men in makeshift hospitals, and all the apparatus of a trapped German cause. The nearest friendly forces, the Second Army under General Adolf Strauss, and elements of 4th Panzer Army farther south, were too far away to mount an immediate relief. A gap of perhaps 50 kilometers separated the encircled forces from any possibility of rescue. In that gap lay snow-covered forests, Soviet defensive positions, and the relentless mathematics of attrition. The encirclement was not complete in the sense of total isolation. German aircraft could still operate from airfields to the rear, and it was this possibility, this slender thread of aerial lifeline, that kept the trapped divisions from spiraling immediately into despair. But the road to Demyansk, that thin line of supply which might eventually be reopened by friendly forces, seemed impossibly distant. The men of the Totenkopf Division and their comrades in the other regiments sealed inside the pocket had no way of knowing whether relief would come in days, weeks, or never. All they knew was that the perimeter was shrinking, the cold was absolute, and their food would not last indefinitely. And so we arrive at the moment when history's focus narrows to a single frozen point on the map, when the strategic overreach of armies translates into individual human suffering. The grand designs of generals and the calculations of high command give way to something far more immediate and terrible, the experience of men sealed in ice and snow, waiting in darkness for deliverance that had not yet been promised. The maps that the German High Command studied in their headquarters grew darker each day as January deepened, the red lines of the Soviet advance closing in with a persistence that began to seem almost inevitable, like a slow tightening fist around something precious and fragile. The winter counteroffensive that Stalin had unleashed was not a single hammer blow, but rather a vast, coordinated squeeze. Multiple Soviet armies pushing westward and southwestward across the frozen landscape, their commanders sensing an opportunity that would not come again. And somewhere within that closing circle, the 6 German divisions that had pushed so far north toward Lake Ilmen found themselves caught in a geometry that was beginning to look less like an operational success and more like a slowly tightening noose. The Totenkopf Division, along with elements of the Wehrmacht's 16th Army, realized almost too late that their forward positions, which had seemed so strategically important just weeks before, had become something else entirely, a trap. The roads behind them, The supply lines that threaded back through the countryside toward the German rear areas were being cut. Soviet cavalry units, mobile and quick, were sliding around the northern flank. At the same time, fresh Red Army divisions were attacking from the south and east, and the German divisions that might have provided relief, or that might have held the lines of retreat open, were themselves pressed back or committed to other desperate fights along an enormously long front. By the second week of January, the moment of true encirclement arrived, though it was not a sudden snap, but rather a gradual realization that spread through the German command as reports came in, as contact with neighboring units was lost, as radio messages began to take on a different tone. The pocket that formed was roughly 70 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide at its deepest point. Not a vast area compared to the scale of the Eastern Front, but substantial enough that when you stood at the edge of the snow-covered fields within it, the encirclement was not always obvious. The landscape itself did not feel entirely enclosed. The horizon still stretched away in all directions, and yet, beyond those horizons, the ring was closing. 6 divisions, roughly 90,000 men in total, though the number fluctuated as some units tried to push outward and as losses mounted. The 16th Army headquarters was among them, along with assorted artillery, supply units, and stragglers who had been caught in the initial advance and could not extricate themselves. The Totenkopf Division, which had entered the war with a reputation born from the concentration camps where its officers and men had been trained in the pre-war years, now found itself in a different kind of prison, not one they had built themselves, but one that seemed to grow tighter each day. The realization that they were truly surrounded took different forms in different parts of the pocket. Some units heard it from their commanders first, in briefings that grew progressively more grave. Others realized it from the changing pattern of artillery fire, not the distant rumble of a front line, but shells coming from multiple directions at once. The supply officers were perhaps the first to understand the true severity, as they began to calculate how long the rations they had on hand could sustain so many men in so brutal a climate. The mathematics they did, quietly, produced numbers that were deeply troubling. What made the encirclement at Demyansk different, in some ways, from other German pockets that would form later in the war, was its timing and its location. It occurred not in the depths of summer or autumn, when a trapped force might hope to forage or to move relatively quickly, but in the deepest cold of a Russian winter, where movement itself became an act of terrible effort. The forests and marshes of the Valdai region, which in other seasons might have offered some possibility of concealment or escape through less traveled routes, were now frozen hard, but their frozen nature did not make them less imposing. In some ways it made them more so, as the temperature sucked the breath from lungs and turned exposed skin to frostbite in minutes. And beyond the physical prison of the snow and ice, there was the prison of circumstance. The German divisions that had been left outside the pocket, that still had contact with the rear and with the supply depots, were themselves under such pressure that they could offer little hope of a rapid breakout. The Wehrmacht command, faced with the loss of so many trained divisions, began to contemplate options that ranged from the desperate to the nearly impossible. Could the trapped forces break out to the west? The estimates suggested that if they abandoned most of their equipment and heavy weapons, they might succeed, but at a cost in casualties that would be enormous. Could they be relieved from outside? That would require the Wehrmacht to gather enough reserves to punch through the Soviet lines, and every reserve the German command possessed was already committed elsewhere along that vast, bleeding front. So the decision that began to form in the minds of the German leadership, almost unspoken at first, grew gradually more concrete. The pocket at Demyansk would have to hold. The forces inside would have to dig in, establish a perimeter, and maintain their positions until either a relief force broke through from outside, or until, and here the calculations became even more grim, until the arrival of spring made a breakthrough possible. In the meanwhile, the trapped men would have to be kept alive, somehow, by whatever means could be found. The machine that was German logistics, already strained to the breaking point by the length of the front and the distances involved, would have to accomplish something it had never attempted before on this scale: to sustain an entire field army from the air, dropping supplies by parachute and by glider into a pocket surrounded by enemies and frozen in ice and snow. The very audacity of the concept was almost unthinkable, and yet there seemed no other choice. For the men of the Totenkopf Division, and for all the soldiers who found themselves within that shrinking circle of snow-covered earth, the encirclement marked a turning point. The moment when the war stopped being something happening to other people in other places, and became instead the whole world, complete and inescapable. The next weeks and months would test not just their physical endurance but something deeper, something about what men could endure when the alternative was unthinkable, when surrender was not really an option they could imagine, and when the only way forward was to hold on, day after frozen day, and hope that someone, somewhere, had a plan that might eventually lead to survival. The snow that had fallen so gently in the first days of the encirclement became, within a week, something closer to a merciless presence. Temperatures that had hovered near freezing dropped with the kind of steadiness that left no room for hope, sinking past 20 below zero, then 30, then into a realm where the thermometer itself became almost decorative rather than informative, because beyond a certain coldness, numbers ceased to describe anything meaningful about human experience. The men inside the pocket, those 6 divisions sealed into a shrinking perimeter around Demyansk, learned very quickly that winter in the Valdai Hills was not merely cold. It was a living thing that entered the body through every gap in uniform and equipment, through boots never fully dried, through fingers that had stopped feeling anything but a distant, spreading numbness. The starvation began, not as a sudden absence, but as a slow, methodical thinning of portions. A soldier might receive, on a fortunate day, something approaching 1,200 calories. On most days, it was considerably less. Bread rations shrank from a full loaf, already thin and sometimes mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies, to slices so fragile they crumbled to powder before they could be brought to the lips. The soup kitchens that had once boiled what they had into something warm and vaguely nourishing now served broths so thin that a man could see through them, broths that contained perhaps a turnip, perhaps a bit of horse meat, or the remains of a horse that had not survived the cold, boiled until all substance had surrendered to the water. One begins to wonder, in the quiet of such a memory, how a human being reconciles the body's demands with the mind's insistence that no food exists. The answer was that they did not reconcile it. They simply endured the divergence, hour by hour. The frostbite was almost as systematic as the hunger, working through the division with a kind of arithmetic precision. First came the men whose boots had worn through, whose feet were perpetually damp despite all efforts to dry them. Then came those whose fingers, even when they curled into mittens, lost all sensation and turned a waxy, pale color that everyone understood meant the tissue was already dying. There was no dramatic moment when a man realized his toes were going to be lost. There was only the slow recognition that the color had changed, that a smell had begun, that infection was advancing in a way that the division's exhausted medical corps could not stop. Field surgeons, their own hands trembling in the cold and lacking proper anesthetic, amputated fingers and toes while men either screamed or lay in a kind of shocked silence, and afterward the stumps were wrapped in whatever bandaging remained, and the men who had lost digits were, in a strange twist, sometimes the fortunate ones, because they had at least received some acknowledgement from a doctor rather than being left to rot from the inside out. What the cold did to the mind, though, was perhaps more insidious than what it did to the body. A man's thoughts grew sluggish and repetitive. The mind, when deprived of warmth and adequate food, tends to circle obsessively around certain topics: the memory of a meal eaten years before, the imagined temperature of a room somewhere far away, the face of a person left behind. One can almost picture them, these soldiers huddled in frozen dugouts and damaged buildings, their eyes half closed not from sleep, but from a kind of mental drift that felt sometimes like mercy and sometimes like the prelude to something worse. Officers noted in their reports, with the detached language that military documentation demands, that cases of self-harm increased as January turned into February. Men would remove their mittens in the night, not always to check their wounds, but sometimes simply because the act of doing so was a choice, and choice itself had become so scarce that any exercise of will, even a terrible one, felt briefly like freedom. The isolation of the pocket was, in some ways, more crushing than the physical deprivation. These men knew that they were cut off. The radio operators confirmed it daily. No relief column was coming from outside, or if one was coming, it was moving with a slowness that suggested it might not arrive before the pocket itself ceased to exist. Supply aircraft arrived irregularly, and they never brought enough. A soldier might see a WW2 transport drop its cargo from a low altitude, and then watch helplessly as much of it landed in enemy territory or was scattered across ice he could not safely reach. The knowledge that salvation was supposed to be coming, that Germany had supposedly solved the problem of keeping an encircled force alive by air alone, and that it was so demonstrably not working, this knowledge sat in the stomach like cold stone. Every day felt like it might be the last day before the situation became irretrievable. Every night seemed to contemplate the possibility that by morning, the order to break out or surrender might come, and no one quite knew which outcome was more terrifying. The men of the Totenkopf Division, in particular, carried an additional weight that perhaps their fellow soldiers in other enclosed units did not carry quite so heavily. They had been formed from the ranks of concentration camp guards. Many of them had volunteered directly into SS service. They had been told for years that they were the elite, the ideological vanguard, the men who would reshape Europe according to a racial order they had been taught to believe in with almost religious fervor. Now those convictions, whether sincerely held or merely recited by rote, collided with a reality in which no ideology kept the cold out, and no devotion to the Führer translated into food. The cognitive dissonance was profound, though whether the men articulated it to themselves in those terms or simply felt a spreading despair that they could not name, that remains, in many cases, unknowable to us now. They had been promised triumph. They had been offered a vision of history bending toward Germanic renewal. Instead, they were dying in a frozen forest in a province they could not even pronounce properly, and no amount of SS indoctrination had prepared them for that particular form of emptiness. The human body, when deprived, begins to consume itself. Muscles atrophied over weeks, until soldiers could barely stand. The skin stretched tighter across faces that had begun to look mask-like, almost skull-like, less human with each passing day, and yet the division continued to demand performance. Officers still issued orders to hold positions, to patrol, to prepare for whatever might come next. Some men found in this continued demand a kind of purpose, a structure that prevented complete psychological dissolution. Others simply obeyed, because obedience was what they had been trained to do, and because disobedience in the Totenkopf Division, under its harsh command structure, could result in consequences almost as swift as hypothermia. One might ask whether survival under such conditions was truly living, or whether it was some kind of suspended state between existence and oblivion. The soldiers themselves likely did not linger on such philosophy. They were too busy trying to stay warm, and trying not to think too hard about when they might eat again. The question that now presented itself to the German High Command was almost absurdly simple on its surface, yet nightmarishly complex in execution. How do you feed and supply 250,000 men in the middle of a frozen wasteland with no ground connection to the world beyond the encirclement? The answer they arrived at, the only answer really, that offered any hope at all, was to attempt something aviation had never truly been asked to do on such a scale. They would supply an entire army from the air. In the depths of January 1942, as the snow continued to pile and the temperatures in the pocket dropped to 20, 30, sometimes 40 degrees below zero, the Luftwaffe began what would become the first major airlift operation of the Second World War. It was a decision born of desperation, yes, but also born of a peculiar confidence, perhaps overconfidence, in what modern aircraft could accomplish when necessity demanded it. The German Air Command believed, not unreasonably at first, that they could keep 6 divisions alive by flying supplies in daily and night after night, shuttling food, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel into the frozen landing grounds that had been carved and maintained by the trapped troops themselves. The principal aircraft assigned to this task was the Junkers Ju-52, the tri-motored transport plane that had become the workhorse of German airlift operations throughout the war. These machines, reliable and relatively robust, were never designed for the kind of punishment that a Russian winter on the Eastern Front could deliver. Yet they were what was available, and they were sent nonetheless. Day after day, in weather that would make most modern air operations unthinkable, the Ju-52s would lumber southward from their bases, near Pskov, and other airfields behind the German lines, their engines straining in the frigid air, their fuselages laden with whatever supplies had been deemed most critical that morning. The journey itself was a trial. The pilots had to navigate by landmarks they could barely see through snow and cloud cover. Instruments often failed in the cold. Visibility could drop to nearly nothing within minutes. Once the aircraft reached the pocket and began their descent toward the landing zones, often nothing more than frozen lakes or roughly cleared fields where ground crews waited in the darkness, they became sitting targets for Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The Soviets, understanding perfectly well what this airlift meant to the trapped Germans, made it a priority to disrupt and destroy the supply columns in the sky. And so the cost began to accumulate, quietly at first, then with a grim and relentless rhythm. Aircraft went down. Some were shot down, others simply disappeared into the snow and cold, mechanical failures or pilot error, combining with the brutal environment to snuff out lives and machines alike. The Ju-52s, tough as they were, began to fall with increasing frequency. By February, the losses were mounting to unsustainable levels, yet the operations continued because there was no alternative. The men on the ground were starving, ammunition was running low, every aircraft that made it through was vital. The crews flying these missions endured their own form of the siege. Many were young, in their early 20s, conscripted into the Luftwaffe from other walks of life. They knew that every mission they flew over the pocket carried a significant chance of not returning. The wear and tear on both aircraft and human nerves was immense. Frostbite claimed fingers and noses among the ground crews at the airfields. Mechanics worked through the night in temperatures that would kill an unprotected man in hours, trying to keep the aircraft flyable, trying to prevent engines from seizing, trying to ensure that at least some fraction of the fleet would be ready for the next day's missions. Consider, for a moment, what it meant for a pilot to fly a Ju-52 in a Russian winter. The cockpit, despite what efforts were made to heat it, remained brutally cold. The controls were sluggish, because the hydraulic fluid was barely fluid at all. Radio communications were frequently lost in the static of the cold ionized atmosphere. A pilot could become disoriented very quickly, lost in cloud banks that turned day into a featureless grey twilight. And always, the thought in the back of the mind, if the engines fail now, if I have to land, there's no rescue coming. There's only the snow. The figures that historians have assembled, piecing together records from both German and Soviet sources, suggest that the Luftwaffe flew something in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 1,200 missions into the Demyansk pocket over the course of the siege. The tonnage delivered, estimates vary, but something in the range of 200 to 300 tons per day on average, was far below what the trapped army actually needed to maintain full combat strength. Military calculations suggested that a force of this size required closer to 1,000 tons daily for full supply. The airlift was, in effect, a life support system that kept the pocket alive but always on the edge of survival, never quite comfortable, never quite secure. And the losses mounted. German records, though incomplete and sometimes contradictory depending on the source, suggest that somewhere between 50 and 100 Ju-52s were lost to combat, accident, and mechanical failure during the Demyansk airlift. Some accounts place the figure higher. Each loss represented not just an aircraft but also the crew, typically 5 men per Ju-52, all of them skilled and trained and in many cases irreplaceable. The cumulative effect was a slow drain on the Luftwaffe's transport capacity at a time when these aircraft were increasingly needed elsewhere on an expanding front. What made the losses particularly poignant was their apparent futility to those experiencing them. A pilot might fly a mission that night, deliver perhaps 3 tons of supplies to the pocket, lose the aircraft to anti-aircraft fire on the way out, and see his contribution disappear into the vastness of hundreds of square miles of encircled men and equipment. Did his sacrifice mean anything? Did those 3 tons of flour and ammunition reach the right hands? Would they make the difference between survival and starvation for someone below? The uncertainty was its own form of torment. The crews developed a grim gallows humor about it all, as men do in desperate circumstances. They nicknamed the route to Demyansk the Bread Run, but there was nothing tender in that nickname. It was edged with irony and exhaustion. The Luftwaffe pilots and transport crews became, in their own way, as trapped as the soldiers they were trying to save. They were bound to a mission that seemed increasingly hopeless, flying in conditions that were growing worse as the winter deepened, watching their comrades' aircraft fail and spiral down into the snow. Theodor Eicke, even as the snow pressed down and the perimeter contracted, did not alter the essential nature of his command. Inside the pocket, with his men freezing and the supply aircraft struggling through the grey sky, he remained what he had always been, a man of absolute demands and uncompromising standards, a figure who believed that ideology and discipline could sustain the body as surely as food and warmth. It is a paradox worth considering slowly, how a leader shaped entirely by the authoritarian structures of the concentration camp, by years of ordering men to commit cruelty, approaches the moment when his own soldiers begin to break under a different kind of pressure entirely. Eicke had built the Totenkopf around a particular kind of devotion, not merely military obedience, though that was demanded too, but a spiritual alignment with the regime's vision of racial hierarchy and national rebirth through struggle. His officers knew this. His non-commissioned men, drawn largely from the SS organizations that had staffed the camps, understood it at a cellular level. They had already crossed a threshold that most soldiers never approached, and now, in the frozen pocket, Eicke demanded that they cross it again and again, deeper still, into sacrifice and suffering, in the name of holding the line. The cold was becoming a weapon in his hands, though not the kind he controlled. We might imagine, and historians suggest this with careful language, based on the fragmented records and testimony that survive, that Eicke saw the suffering as a form of purification. The men enduring it were being tested. Those who fell away, who weakened, who questioned, were revealing themselves as unfit for the racial struggle he believed was being waged. Ruthlessness, in this view, was not cruelty, but clarity. Every soldier lost was a soldier who had failed the test of will. And yet the losses mounted in ways that even ideology could not readily explain away. The Totenkopf Division had entered the Soviet Union at full strength in the summer of 1941, a combat formation of roughly 20,000 men, equipped and trained to the highest standard the SS could provide. By the time the pocket closed around them in January 1942, they had already suffered hundreds of casualties in the autumn fighting. Now, inside the shrinking perimeter, with rations cut to near starvation levels, with temperatures dropping to 30, 40, sometimes 50 degrees below 0 Celsius, frostbite and gangrene began to claim men as surely as any bullet. Eicke's response was characteristically unforgiving. He issued orders demanding that commanders maintain discipline, that looting and self-preservation be punished with execution if necessary, that the men continue to resist Soviet attacks with the same aggression they had shown in open warfare. To have faltered, to have acknowledged the mounting evidence that the pocket might not hold, would have been to admit something he could not admit, that the devotion he demanded might not be sufficient against the simple physics of survival in extreme cold on minimal food. So he did not falter. The demands continued. The executions of those who broke or deserted continued. The expectation that SS men should simply endure, like machines designed specifically for endurance, remained unaltered. What emerges from the fragmentary letters and accounts that historians have pieced together is a portrait of a division beginning to fragment from within, not from cowardice, but from the slow erosion of the human body, confronted with conditions that exceed any reasonable threshold. Men developed frostbite so severe that the gangrenous tissue had to be amputated with field surgical tools meant for something far less extensive. Pneumonia spread through the crowded bunkers and dugouts where men huddled for warmth. Starvation induced a particular kind of delirium where the mind begins to play tricks on the senses, and a soldier might spend hours staring at a frozen patch of ground, convinced it was food. The division's medical officers, themselves inadequately supplied with medicine and instruments, found themselves making impossible choices about which men could be saved and which had to be left to die in the unheated medical tents. Consider what this moment demanded of an officer like Eicke. He was receiving contradictory signals from higher command. Berlin insisted that the pocket must hold. The Luftwaffe promised that resupply would be sufficient, though it was clearly failing to deliver the quantities needed. His own men were dying not from enemy action, but from conditions that no amount of ideological commitment could overcome. A different leader might have bent, might have reduced the demands, might have acknowledged the reality unfolding around him. Eicke did something different. He appears to have intensified his demands, as if by force of will and the sharpness of his orders, he could somehow override the slow physics of freezing and starving bodies. The casualty figures from inside the pocket tell a story that no official report adequately conveys. We know that the Totenkopf Division lost somewhere in the region of 3,000 men during the siege, dead from all causes, missing, captured, or evacuated in the later stages due to wounds that made continued combat impossible. This represented roughly 15% of the division's original strength, though these numbers were concentrated among the enlisted men and junior officers who actually held the line in the trenches. In certain companies and battalions, the losses were far worse, approaching 50% or more. An entire generation of junior officers and experienced non-commissioned men was ground away in the snow and mud of the pocket. What was the psychological weight of this, day after day, for Eicke and for his command staff? They could see the men dying. They could feel the cold themselves, though they had access to better quarters and rations than the ordinary soldiers. They could count the aircraft that failed to arrive, the loads of supplies that fell short of what had been promised, and yet the orders continued. Hold the line, resist the Soviet attacks, do not weaken, do not question. It is tempting to interpret this as simple callousness, and there was certainly an element of that, but it may have been something stranger, a man so thoroughly embedded in an ideology of total struggle that he could not contemplate any other response, could not imagine stepping outside the framework that had shaped his entire existence. The mounting casualties did produce certain shifts in the pocket's organization. As losses accumulated, companies were consolidated. Understrength platoons were merged. The original structure of the division began to blur and reform, almost like a living organism attempting to maintain itself while pieces were being removed. Eicke appears to have accepted these structural changes, pragmatic adjustments to the deteriorating situation, but the standards of discipline and performance that he demanded did not change. If anything, the evidence suggests they hardened. A man who had already demonstrated weakness through illness or cold injury might find himself reassigned to the most dangerous sector of the line, might be given responsibilities that seemed designed to test his will to the breaking point. Was this cruelty? Was it the logical extension of the SS system that Eicke had helped build? Or was it something he genuinely believed was necessary to maintain the cohesion that kept the pocket from collapsing entirely into chaos? These are questions that historians continue to sit with, recognizing that the answer is probably some combination of all three, impossible to neatly separate in the frozen darkness of a Russian winter where ideology and survival pressure tangled together in ways that still resist easy understanding. While the German soldiers inside the pocket fought the cold and hunger that seemed almost alive in itself, the men who surrounded them, the Soviet forces arrayed across those frozen distances, were engaged in their own equally brutal calculus of survival and pressure. The encirclement that held the Germans at Demyansk was not a static cage, you see. It was a living, breathing thing, constantly tested and reinforced and contested, as if the landscape itself were a living organism that both sides were trying to command. The Soviet 11th Army, under General Meretskov, had the primary responsibility for sealing the pocket, and to understand what that meant, you must imagine the terrain they occupied. Picture a landscape of profound winter desolation. There were frozen marshes that in summer would have been impassable swamps, now transformed into sheets of brittle ice that could crack under a man's full weight if he strayed beyond the paths that experience had taught. There were sparse forests of birch and pine, their branches heavy and drooping under accumulated snow, creating corridors of visibility so short that enemies could emerge from the whiteness with almost no warning. The ground between these woods was open in places, but the openness offered no advantage to either side. It was simply cold, empty, and deadly to cross. The Soviet units surrounding the pocket were themselves stretched thin, often spread across frontages far too wide for the number of soldiers available to hold them. Can you imagine that peculiar kind of tension? To be part of a force meant to contain and strangle an enemy, and yet to know that your own lines were paper thin, that a determined German breakthrough in the right place might simply rupture everything you had been ordered to hold. The Soviets were bringing in reinforcements constantly, but logistics were nearly as taxed for them as for the Germans, perhaps more so in some respects, because while German supply failures meant their men went without, Soviet supply failures meant that the entire operation to compress the pocket might collapse. The villages around Demyansk became points of fixation and grinding struggle. Places like Shcheglovka, Zavedenie, Vishnyovets, names that meant nothing in the wider strategy of war, and yet everything to the men who fought and died over them. These were not the dramatic fortress strongholds of grand military narrative. They were simply settlements, often small, sometimes barely more than a collection of wooden structures clustered together in the landscape. But they sat along the perimeter of the pocket, or along potential supply corridors, and that geography made them matter. The fighting around these villages took on a particular character. It was rarely the sweeping cavalry-like engagements of earlier campaigns. Instead, it was what soldiers have often called attritional warfare, a grinding, methodical process of advance, resistance, counterattack, and withdrawal. A German unit might attack to widen a corridor through which supplies could flow. Soviet forces would respond by moving reserves to block the gap. The German assault would break down. Then, days or hours later, another German unit would attempt the same maneuver in a slightly different location, and the terrible mathematics would begin again. Temperatures in January and February of that winter ranged between 15 and 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit on average, with wind chill dropping them further into genuinely lethal territory. When soldiers engaged in combat in such conditions, the cold became a third combatant, indifferent to ideology or allegiance. Men firing rifles found that their weapons could jam if oil froze in the mechanisms. Fingers, even gloved fingers, could lose sensation quickly, and a man fighting without full sensory feedback in his hands was a man whose aim and reaction time both diminished. Isn't it peculiar how we often think of winter warfare in terms of morale and willpower, and forget that the physical properties of cold transform the very nature of combat itself? The Soviets were as affected by this cold as the Germans, but there was something almost like an inverse relationship at play. The Soviets, defending their homeland and often rotating troops through the lines more regularly than the Germans could manage, seemed to possess a psychological infrastructure adapted to this kind of suffering. This is not to say they did not suffer equally. They did, and many Soviet soldiers froze or died of wounds complicated by cold. But there may have been a difference in what the suffering meant to them in terms of morale. The Germans, increasingly aware that they were far from home and trapped in an unforeseen situation, bore the cold with a different psychological weight. The terrain itself became a factor in the tactics employed. The frozen marshes, once you understood them, could be crossed in certain places and became natural corridors for movement. Both sides learned these paths, and the fighting often concentrated on controlling the routes through the marshes rather than on holding large stretches of open woodland. The forests, meanwhile, offered concealment, but also constrained movement. A unit trying to move quickly through dense woods in deep snow was a unit that moved slowly and in vulnerability to ambush. Imagine the Soviets attempting to methodically compress the pocket through attacks that often seemed almost routine in their lack of variety. An artillery barrage, an assault from a particular direction, a consolidation of small gains, a preparation for the next barrage. The scale was smaller than at some other points on the Eastern Front, but the consistency was relentless, and the human cost accumulated day by day, hour by hour. Soviet commanders, like their German counterparts, were under pressure from above to achieve results, and results meant closing the noose tighter, which meant attempting assaults even when the chances of success seemed questionable. What's perhaps most difficult to convey about this kind of warfare is the way it occupies the mind. It is not dramatic, and it is not quickly resolved. It stretches across weeks and months, and each day brings a small battle that seems identical to the one before it, and yet which carries the same weight of consequence. Men die not in moments of grand heroism, but in the process of executing tasks that seem almost mundane. A squad moves forward, gunfire erupts, some men fall, the others keep moving, or they retreat. Another day begins. The Soviet forces gradually, almost imperceptibly, were tightening their grasp. The perimeter of the pocket was not contracting dramatically month by month, but it was contracting, a slow constriction that meant the Germans inside had less and less room, fewer and fewer options, and an ever deeper awareness that the airlift they depended upon was becoming increasingly important simply to stay alive. Every German soldier inside the pocket knew that the Soviets were there, surrounding them, testing the perimeter, waiting for an opportunity, or simply for time itself to do the work of destruction. Within that frozen pocket, something moved through the ranks of the Totenkopf Division that was more powerful than hunger or cold. It was an ideology so deeply woven into the fabric of the unit that it had become almost invisible to those who lived it, a lens through which every order was received, every sacrifice justified, every enemy death rationalized. To understand how men endured in that hellish encirclement, to comprehend the particular ferocity with which they fought, we must step back for a moment and consider the spiritual and philosophical machinery that had been installed in their minds since the division's inception. The Waffen-SS was not simply a military organization. It was conceived as an elite, quasi-religious brotherhood, bound not primarily by national patriotism in the conventional sense, but by a mystical devotion to Adolf Hitler as a historical figure, a racial savior, and a living embodiment of German destiny. The men of the Totenkopf Division, many of whom had served first as concentration camp guards, had been deliberately selected and indoctrinated into a worldview that placed them on a pedestal above ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. They were told repeatedly that they represented the future of Europe, the vanguard of a racial awakening. This was not propaganda whispered from propaganda loudspeakers at rallies. It was the daily catechism of their existence. Theodor Eicke himself, the division's commanding officer and a committed ideologue, understood that holding men together in conditions of extreme deprivation required something more than military discipline. Discipline alone breaks when supplies fail and hope dims. What held the Totenkopf together in that pocket was a deeper binding, a sense of mission beyond mere survival. These men, or so they had been taught to believe, were fighting not just for Germany, but for the preservation of what they understood as a superior racial order. The Soviet Union, in their ideological framework, represented everything contaminated and degenerate. Every enemy soldier killed was not merely a military objective, but a blow struck against chaos itself. When a man is convinced he is part of a cosmic struggle between light and darkness, between order and destruction, between racial purity and racial pollution. The mathematics of ordinary warfare, cost versus gain, survival versus honor, begins to shift. This ideology, let us be clear, was intertwined with unprecedented cruelty. The same division that would suffer so terribly in the Demyansk pocket had established itself as one of the most brutal combat formations in the Wehrmacht during its campaigns in France and the Soviet Union. The killing of prisoners of war, the targeting of civilians, the execution of commissars and suspected partisans, these were not aberrations born of battlefield chaos. They were the logical expressions of a worldview that denied certain human beings full moral status. It is a haunting historical truth that ferocity in combat often follows a certain path when the enemy is perceived not merely as a rival military force, but as an existential threat to one's own race. Within the encirclement at Demyansk, as temperatures plunged deeper into regions that human beings were not designed to survive, as hunger gnawed at the belly and frostbite blackened fingers and toes, what kept the Totenkopf soldiers fighting with such grim determination? Historians examining letters and testimonies from the period have noted something striking. These men did not often write of wanting to go home, or of doubting the war itself. Instead, they wrote of duty, of standing firm against the Soviet tide, of proving their worth as SS soldiers. The ideology had become so thoroughly internalized that even in conditions of extremity, it structured how they understood their suffering. They were enduring not because they believed they might win in any rational sense, but because to break, to surrender, to fail in the eyes of their unit and their Führer would represent a kind of spiritual catastrophe far worse than physical death. This raises a question that historians and psychologists have struggled with for decades. How malleable is the human mind? How deeply can a system of belief reshape the way a person perceives suffering, death, and moral reality itself? The Totenkopf Division in the Demyansk pocket offers a dark case study. These were not cartoon villains or inhuman monsters. They were men who had been systematically taught to understand the world through a particular lens, and that lens, once ground and installed, was remarkably difficult to remove. Many who survived Demyansk continued to serve with distinction in SS units throughout the rest of the war, some even outliving the Reich itself, carrying their ideology with them into the post-war years. Yet it is equally important to recognize that ideology, no matter how powerful, does not eliminate the human body's physical reality. A man may be convinced of his racial superiority, may believe himself engaged in a sacred struggle, and still freeze to death in a snowdrift. He may still weep when his comrade dies beside him, still feel hunger as a force that cannot be philosophized away. Within the encirclement, the terrible paradox began to reveal itself. Men who had been taught that they represented a superior order were dying in conditions of squalor and degradation that made no distinction between the racially pure and the supposedly degenerate. The snow fell equally on all, the cold penetrated every ideology, and the body's suffering gradually began to crack the certainty that had been so carefully constructed. This collision between belief and physical reality would become increasingly pronounced as the weeks of the Demyansk siege wore on. The more isolated the pocket became, the more tenuous the supply line, the more the soldiers found themselves confronted with a question that their ideological framework had not adequately prepared them to answer. If they were truly the superior force, the racial vanguard, how could they be trapped, starving, and dying by the thousands in a frozen wasteland? The answer, their leaders insisted, lay in ultimate victory deferred, in the testing of their will by providence, in the temporary setback that would be overcome by the iron determination of the German people. But doubt, once it begins to seep in, is difficult to stop. The snow that had seemed almost beautiful in those first winter days, clean, white, transforming the landscape into something almost untouched, became after weeks and weeks something altogether different. It became a canvas for suffering that accumulated, day by day, in ways that statistics would later struggle to capture. The field hospitals, hastily established in whatever buildings the men could find or improvise within the pocket, filled not with the dramatic scenes of sudden catastrophe, but with the slow, grinding consequences of cold and hunger working on human bodies that had been pushed beyond what those bodies could endure. Consider what cold does to a man when he is not only cold but also malnourished, when his rations have been cut again and again as the airlift delivers less than the pocket demands, when his boots are perpetually wet and his fingers have long since lost their feeling. The frostbite began mildly enough, a whitening of the toes, a numbness that soldiers might almost welcome because it meant an absence of pain. But then came the thawing, and the pain of thawing is something quite different, something that penetrated even the exhaustion and despair that had settled over the men like another layer of winter itself. The field hospitals, such as they were, had little morphine left. They had few antibiotics. They had surgeons working by lamplight in temperatures so cold that their instruments would freeze between procedures, and the men would lie on operating tables, really just planks, waiting for amputations that might save their lives, or might simply condemn them to a different sort of slow death. The Totenkopf Division had entered the encirclement with a strength of roughly 14,000 men. That number had meaning only if you understood it as 14,000 individual bodies, each one capable of cold, each one requiring food, each one capable of fear and despair. By mid-February, the division's strength had fallen to perhaps 8,000. The mathematics of attrition in a siege pocket operate differently than they do in ordinary combat. In ordinary warfare, a soldier might be killed in battle, quickly, or wounded and evacuated to a proper hospital far behind the lines where recovery was possible. But in a pocket, there is nowhere to evacuate to. The wounded stayed where they were, in the pocket, consuming rations that the living needed, occupying space in hospitals that were themselves freezing, tended by medical orderlies who were themselves growing weaker. The division's records, insofar as they survived the war, hint at the nature of the losses without quite capturing the texture of them. Frostbite was the great silent killer, not dramatic, not something that appeared in the official casualty reports with quite the same weight as combat deaths, but lethal in its own way. A man with severe frostbite might recover, but he might also develop gangrene in the weeks after, or sepsis in those makeshift hospitals where hygiene was a luxury that the cold and the shortage of supplies had made nearly impossible. Pneumonia came quietly too, settling into the chest of a man already weakened by hunger and exposure, and then there was little to be done except watch and wait for the end. There is something particularly human about the way a body fails under these conditions, not the clean failure of a bullet wound, but the slow compromise that occurs when warmth and nutrition and hope all drain away at once. The men developed sores that would not heal. They developed a particular form of despair that was almost physiological, a flattening of will that made even the simplest tasks seem impossible. Some historians have noted that morale, oddly, remained relatively stable within the pocket, at least among the SS units, but morale and the body's capacity to function are not the same thing. A man might believe in his cause, might trust his officers, might even maintain something resembling discipline and order, and yet still be slowly dying from the inside out, his body consuming itself in the search for warmth and energy. The field hospitals themselves reflected this grim calculus. They were crowded, inevitably, because there were always more wounded and frostbitten than there were beds. In some cases, men lay on straw on the floor, covered with what blankets could be spared, while orderlies moved between them checking for signs of life. The smell was one that those who experienced it rarely forgot: human waste, gangrene, death, and something else too, something that might have been despair itself, if despair had a scent. The surgeons worked with a kind of quiet grimness, amputating limbs that could not be saved, binding wounds that could not be truly healed, making decisions about who would receive the last of the drugs and who would not. These were men trained in medicine, shaped by the culture of the Third Reich, and yet still human enough to feel the weight of those decisions. The division's original strength, as mentioned, had been substantial. The Totenkopf was a large unit, well equipped when it entered the pocket. confident in its training and its leadership. But confidence and equipment mean nothing against cold and hunger and time. By early March, the division had lost perhaps half its original strength, and the losses were still accelerating. The replacement troops that arrived by air were often inadequately trained, sometimes barely more than boys conscripted into the SS, and they died at higher rates than the original men because they lacked the hardening and the knowledge that experience in Russia had provided. The division that emerged from Demyansk, when the pocket was finally relieved, was not the same organization that had entered it. It was smaller, harder, more bitter, and in some ineffable way, already haunted. What is perhaps most striking, in a quiet sort of way, is how completely the human cost of the pocket has been obscured by the focus on the airlift itself, on the dramatic narrative of Luftwaffe transport planes struggling through the snow, on Theodor Eicker's demands and Hitler's orders. The men who died in those field hospitals, who were buried in shallow graves in the frozen earth, who simply vanished into the statistical losses of the Eastern Front, they remain largely invisible. Their names, in many cases, were never properly recorded. The families who waited for letters that never came, who eventually received notification that their sons or husbands had died in Russia, did not know the specific shape of that death, the particular cold, the particular hunger, the particular moment when the body's capacity to endure simply gave out. They knew only that someone they loved had been lost in a place called Demyansk, and in a war that would ultimately claim millions. While the German soldiers huddled in their frozen pocket, enduring rationed bread and the nightmare of airlift dependency, the Soviet forces encircling them faced their own particular and grinding ordeal. The winter of 1942 showed no mercy to either side. It was a shared tribulation, equally distributed across no man's land, equally punishing beneath the same grey sky. The Red Army units surrounding Demyansk suffered losses that rarely appear in the same historical paragraphs, yet their story threads through the entire siege, often unheard and nearly forgotten. Picture a Soviet soldier standing watch in a dugout carved from frozen earth, his breath turning to ice crystals before his eyes. His felt boots, perhaps padded with straw if he was fortunate, offered only modest protection against temperatures that routinely dropped to 20, 30, sometimes 40 degrees below zero. The Wehrmacht forces inside the pocket received aerial supplies, irregular though they were, desperately inadequate as they often proved. But the Soviet encirclement often relied on whatever could be transported across roads that became rivers of mud as the thaw approached. Supply lines stretched back toward Moscow and the western approaches, vulnerable to German air raids and disrupted by the vastness of the front itself. A Soviet infantryman received less food than his German counterpart trapped inside, not through mercy or design, but through the sheer logistical chaos of the Red Army's own circumstances. Bread portions shrank, soup grew thinner, the ration allowance for frontline troops never quite matched the demand, and that demand was relentless. The Soviet commanders knew that Demyansk was strategically vital. The German penetration so deep into Russian territory represented not merely a military threat, but a symbol of continued German aggression on Soviet soil. To eliminate an encircled enemy force was to reverse momentum, to prove that the German advance could be stopped, contained, and rolled back. Moscow demanded results. The general staff in the Kremlin, under Stalin's scrutiny, pressured the commanders around Demyansk to squeeze the pocket, to compress its perimeter, to force surrender or annihilation. General Kuzmin, commanding the Soviet encirclement forces, received orders that admitted little flexibility. The surrounded Germans must not break out. They must not be relieved from outside. The pocket must die. Yet intention and execution diverged sharply in winter warfare, particularly across terrain as hostile and complex as the frozen landscape around Demyansk. The Red Army soldiers were not fighting across open plains. They were navigating marshes and forests where the permafrost created a deceptive crust, solid enough to bear weight one moment, treacherous enough to collapse the next. Villages lay scattered through this wilderness. each one a potential strongpoint, each one requiring assault and careful clearing. The Soviets could encircle, could maintain a perimeter, could press inward at certain vulnerable points, but they could not simply will the Germans to surrender through mere proximity. The Wehrmacht forces, though trapped, remained dangerous, remained organized, and remained supplied by air, and that final fact grated on every Soviet commander trying to justify mounting casualties to superiors who demanded breakthrough. The Luftwaffe's transport aircraft, the Junkers 52s primarily, reliable workhorses of German aviation, flew daily missions into the pocket during this period, timing their arrivals for pre-dawn hours when Soviet fighter cover was thinnest. Soviet anti-aircraft crews positioned around the encirclement watched these planes rise and descend with frustration. Each successful landing meant survival for German troops. Each successful takeoff meant Soviet prisoners and wounded Axis personnel evacuated to safety. The Soviets lacked the fighter strength at certain moments to prevent every supply drop. German air superiority during daylight hours, though contested and eroding, complicated Soviet ability to seal the pocket completely. A Soviet artillery commander or infantry officer would observe these transports coming in, knowing that somewhere in the Kremlin, his own higher command was being questioned about why the encirclement had not yet become a tomb. The Soviet soldiers themselves rarely recorded their internal perspective in detailed letters or diaries during this period. The circumstances of constant combat, constant cold, constant supply strain left little opportunity for reflection, yet archival fragments suggest deep weariness. A Soviet sergeant might acknowledge to fellow platoon members that they were being asked to accomplish something extraordinarily difficult, to maintain an offensive posture, to press an attack, to prevent any breakout, all while their own supply situation deteriorated and their own casualties mounted. The encirclement required not a single massive assault, but rather sustained pressure across multiple approaches, rotating units to prevent complete exhaustion, and attritional grinding that demanded reserves the Soviet command structure struggled to provide. Each day, the pocket remained unbroken, meant Soviet losses continued. Officers understood that patience would solve the problem, that eventually supply or relief would fail for the Germans. But Stalin and the General Staff did not always reward patience. They demanded action, demanded progress, demanded visible signs of encirclement hardening. Some Soviet units, approaching from certain angles, encountered particularly fierce German resistance. The Totenkopf Division, for all its internal struggles with cold and hunger, maintained discipline and fighting capacity precisely because its officers, like Theodor Eicke, had imposed such strict hierarchical control. When Soviet infantry probed weaknesses in the perimeter, they often encountered SS counterattacks delivered with brutal efficiency. The SS men fought with the desperation of men who believed they faced annihilation if the pocket fell. Soviet soldiers, conversely, fought from increasingly disconnected motivation. They fought because ordered to, because they were trapped in their own way, because retreat meant death at the hands of blocking detachments, but also, it must be said, because many harbored genuine determination to stop the German invasion, to push it back, to defend their homeland. These motivations intertwined, creating a complex human tension that resolved itself only through blood and cold. The territory surrounding the pocket became a landscape of shallow graves and frozen bodies left where they fell. Soviet wounded sometimes froze to death during the night because transport to aid stations was sparse or impossible. German prisoners captured by Soviet forces and held in the open without adequate shelter experienced mortality rates that rivaled those of the besieged inside. The war around Demyansk did not distinguish between kindnesses. It was, in its essence, an indiscriminate catastrophe wearing a political uniform. And yet the Soviet forces did not waver, despite the cost and the complexity and the gnawing awareness that their own supplies might give out before German supplies did. They pressed, they held, they waited, they attacked at chosen moments, and prepared for the German breakout attempts that some commanders expected would come as spring approached. The determination was real, born of necessity and ideology, and simple soldier's duty, all three woven so tightly together that by late winter 1942 they had become inseparable. A Soviet officer, ensuring that his regiment held its sector of the perimeter, was not thinking in terms of grand strategy or ideological victory. He was thinking of tomorrow's survival, of how to maintain discipline in men suffering from frostbite and malnutrition, of how to keep the pocket closed against an enemy that still possessed the resources to threaten a breakout. By late February, the weight of the encirclement had begun to press differently against the minds of the German commanders outside the pocket. The airlift, for all its desperate courage and the ash-grey ghosts of dying Junkers aircraft littering the snow, could not sustain an entire army. Fuel ran short, crews exhausted themselves. The mathematics of hunger inside the pocket grew only darker with each passing day, and so the High Command turned to a possibility that had seemed remote only weeks before. The possibility that a ground relief force might break through from the west and establish a narrow corridor, a thin vein of supply and reinforcement, through which the encircled forces could at last breathe. This corridor would become known as the Ramoshevo Corridor, named for a small village that sat like a pivot point in the contested landscape between the outer relief force and the inner perimeter of the pocket. To understand what it meant is to understand the desperation and the impossible mathematics of warfare in that frozen region. The distance was short. Perhaps 30 kilometers separated the German forces trying to break inward from those trapped within, but 30 kilometers across terrain dominated by Soviet artillery, held by Soviet infantry dug deep into forest and frozen marsh, defended with the accumulated rage of months of encirclement, was less a distance than a chasm. The relief operation, codenamed Unternehmen Fallreap, Operation Lifeline, began in earnest in the middle of February. General Georg von Sodenstern, commanding the outer relief force, gathered what units he could spare and began to push eastward along roads that turned to sheets of ice, through villages that offered no shelter and no mercy. These were not fresh troops. They had fought through the autumn and the terrible winter. Frostbite had claimed as many men as Soviet bullets. Supply was rationed almost as severely outside the pocket as within it, and yet they moved forward, because the alternative was to watch the pocket die slowly, man by man, from the inside. The fighting for Ramoshevo itself became a kind of terrible geometry. The village was never large, a cluster of timber structures, a few roads converging, and then the forest in all directions, but it lay directly on the corridor that the Germans needed to open. Soviet forces, understanding this as clearly as any German staff officer, poured reinforcements into the surrounding positions. What emerged was a brutal, grinding attrition. The Germans would attack, perhaps gain a few hundred meters, then be pushed back by counterattack. The snow became trampled and dark with blood. Supply routes became kill zones. Artillery fire from both sides filled the short winter days with constant thunder. Consider what it meant to be a soldier in one of those relief units, or in the Totenkopf positions attempting to break outward toward the approaching forces. You were fighting not for territory that mattered. Ramoshevo held no strategic value beyond its position in space. You were fighting for the chance to maintain a supply line, a passage, a thread of connection that might mean the difference between survival and slow dissolution. Every meter had to be paid for in casualties. Every meter gained had to be held against immediate, furious counterattack. And all the while, the weather remained your true enemy, temperatures still dropping toward -30 degrees Celsius on the worst nights, frostbite claiming fingers and toes from men who had long since stopped feeling pain in their extremities. The Luftwaffe attempted to provide air support from above, but the weather in March grew even more treacherous than in February. Snow and cloud obscured the ground. Visibility became a luxury pilots could rarely afford, and the Soviet Air Force, though smaller in numbers, fought with a growing competence and ferocity. Each sortie became a gamble. Pilots who flew multiple times in the same day often could not remember, by evening, which towns they had bombed or which forests they had strafed. The landscape beneath them all looked the same, white, vast, indifferent to human ambition. Inside the pocket, the knowledge that a relief corridor was being fought for created a strange tension. On the one hand, it offered hope. On the other, it meant that German forces were expending irreplaceable casualties in an attempt to reach the encircled men. Some soldiers in the pocket watched the eastern perimeter, trying to gauge from the sound and frequency of artillery whether the relief forces were advancing or being pushed back. Were the rumbles of distant guns growing closer or more distant? It was impossible to know with certainty. Radio communications were sporadic, encrypted messages filtered through chain of command, and by the time information reached a freezing private in a foxhole, it was often hours old, possibly contradicted by new developments on ground they could not see. Theodor Eker, commanding the Totenkopf Division from within the pocket, was acutely aware of the relief effort. He understood that his men's survival, and more importantly, the reputation of his division, depended on the ability to hold out long enough for the corridor to open, and then to maintain discipline within the pocket, while that corridor remained under constant threat of closure. He demanded that certain divisions within the pocket maintain offensive posture, not merely defensive positions. He wanted units ready to push eastward when the moment came, to link with the relief forces, to maintain momentum. This meant continuous offensive operations, even as supplies dwindled, even as casualties mounted, even as the psychological pressure of encirclement weighed on men who had not seen a warm meal in weeks. The corridor, when it finally stabilized in mid-March, was never more than a few kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It ran roughly north to south, a thin scar in the landscape, always under fire from Soviet positions on both flanks. German supply convoys that attempted to use it faced constant danger. Trucks could not move in daylight. They moved at night, their headlights extinguished, following white markers laid out by other vehicles in a slow, careful crawl across ground that remained partially frozen and partially treacherous with melt. One miscalculation, one truck rolling off the narrow passage, and the vehicle would be visible to Soviet observers in daylight. It would be destroyed, and the passage would be narrower still. Yet the corridor meant that, for the first time in weeks, regular supplies could reach the encircled divisions. Not abundance, never abundance, but enough flour to sustain a ration, enough ammunition to continue operations, enough medical supplies to treat the worst frostbite cases, though many men had already progressed past the point where treatment could save their limbs. It meant that the pocket was no longer entirely dependent on the Luftwaffe's exhausted pilots and their dying aircraft. It meant that, for the moment, the men trapped in the snow could begin to imagine survival as something more than an abstract possibility. But the corridor remained contested territory. German and Soviet forces fought continuously along its flanks. Artillery fire seldom ceased completely, and the constant combat meant that the relief forces themselves were being bled white, their ranks hollowed by casualties, their equipment worn by constant use in sub-zero conditions. The German High Command faced an agonizing equation. How long could they afford to pour reinforcements into maintaining a corridor that itself required constant reinforcement to remain open? What is striking, when examining the records and accounts of the Rameshevo corridor, is how much energy was expended to maintain a passage that was never secure, never fully reliable, and never capable of providing the quantity of supplies that might have allowed the pocket to fully recover and break out. It was a solution that addressed only a portion of the problem. It bought time, perhaps, but at tremendous cost, and it raised a question that would haunt German strategy for the remainder of the war. If so much effort was required to maintain a narrow corridor in favorable terrain against an enemy weakened by months of siege, what would happen in a similar situation with larger distances, worse terrain, and fewer resources to spare? What words might a soldier have reached for in those frozen weeks, had he found a pencil that still worked, paper that wasn't brittle with cold? The historical record preserves fragments, scraps of letters recovered from the pocket, diary entries hurried by firelight, accounts recorded by men who survived and spoke years afterward. What follows is drawn from those echoes, a careful reconstruction of the kinds of thoughts and observations that moved through the minds of the trapped men, composed from the patterns we find in primary testimony and the known conditions they endured. Think of it less as precise quotation and more as a portrait built from truthful detail. A junior officer of the Totenkopf, let us say, might have written home in early February, though the letter would never leave the pocket. His hands were so cold that holding a pen required removing a glove for only brief moments. He described the sound of the wind at night, not a whistle, but a low, sustained groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, as though the frozen marshes and forests were slowly breathing in their sleep. Around him, the candles in the dugout were made from rendered fat, and they cast shadows that seemed almost alive against the walls of frozen clay and wood. He wrote of the peculiar smell of the pocket, smoke and mold and something else, a faint sweetness that was the smell of men who could not wash and could not move enough to keep their blood warm. The thought of it troubles him, even as he writes. He wonders if his wife would recognize him if she saw him now, whether the face that looked back from the occasional polished metal surface was still his own. In another account, a radio operator recalls the mathematics of starvation with the precision of someone who has come to think in terms of calories and grams. The official ration was stated in the orders, but reality moved further and further from that number with each passing week. He remembers the day a horse died, not in combat, but simply from exhaustion and hunger, and the speed with which it was butchered and distributed. There was no waste, no squeamishness. The meat was tough and dark, but it was protein, and protein was the currency of survival. He recalls too the men who began to lose the thread of conversation, whose eyes grew distant, who sat facing the same direction for hours without moving. These were men whose bodies were consuming themselves, and everyone knew the progression that followed. The silence of the pocket at rest was not peaceful. It was the silence of things being unmade. A medic who served with one of the attached sanitation squads would later describe what he called the geology of cold injury. Frostbite did not arrive all at once. It crept slowly from the extremities inward, and the pain of tissue dying was, paradoxically, less than the pain of thawing. He had learned to recognize the early signs, the paleness, the waxy appearance of skin, the moment when a man's toes began to go numb. And then there was nothing to be done, except to keep the affected area as dry as possible and wait. Some men lost fingers, some lost entire hands, a few lost both feet, and yet continued to refuse evacuation, clinging to their unit identities even as they were stretchered toward the inadequate medical facilities inside the pocket. Why? The medic could not fully explain it. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was a form of madness brought on by exposure and hunger. Perhaps it was simply that the idea of leaving felt like surrender, and surrender felt like a death of a different kind. Another soldier, a rifleman in one of the combat platoons, recorded his impressions in fragments of thought, not sentences. The cold, the waiting, the moment of surprise attack in the dark, the muzzle flash lighting the falling snow, the retreat. The faces of the wounded, always the faces. He noted the changing quality of light, how in early February the darkness lasted nearly the whole day, how by late February the sun began to linger a bit longer, though it brought no warmth. He observed how men's behavior changed with the light. In total darkness, there was a kind of numbness that almost resembled calm, but as the days lengthened and the temperature barely rose above the killing cold, something like desperation began to stir. If we survive the cold, he wrote, we may not survive the hope that we might survive. The testimonies tell us of a peculiar exhaustion that gripped the pocket, not the clean tiredness that follows labor, but something more fundamental. Men could sleep for 18 hours and wake feeling no more rested. Their dreams were vivid and strange, often involving food they had not tasted in months, or homes they were not sure they would ever see. A sergeant wrote that he had begun to dream in color again, after weeks of seeing the world in only whites and greys and blacks. That detail, the recovery of color in dreaming, seemed to him almost cruel. It meant his mind still believed in summer, even as his body was slowly shutting down. The letters and accounts also capture something of the peculiar tension between routine and chaos. There were still orders to be followed, still hierarchies to maintain, still the rhythm of roll calls and guard duties, and the distribution of whatever rations had arrived that day. A captain of Totenkopf noted how this maintenance of military structure was perhaps what kept men sane, the fact that they could still be soldiers, could still have duties and purposes beyond mere survival, and yet that same structure demanded endurance that grew harder to meet with each passing day. The orders came down from Theodor Eicke and his senior officers. Hold this ground, defend that village, be ready to move on an hour's notice. And the men obeyed, not because they believed they would be relieved, or that relief was possible, but because obedience was what they knew, and it required less thought than despair. What comes through most poignantly in these reconstructed voices is neither heroism nor cowardice, but rather a kind of grinding commitment to the immediate moment. None of these men, the officer, the radio operator, the medic, the rifleman, the sergeant, the captain, could see beyond the next day or the next week. The pocket was their entire world. The war that raged elsewhere was almost abstract. What was real was the cold, the hunger, the weight of exhaustion, the faces of the men beside them, and the expectation that they would continue, somehow, to do what they were asked to do. There was pride in this, yes, but it was a lean and stripped-down pride, emptied of the grand ideologies that had once filled the Waffen-SS vision. What remained was simply the determination of men to endure, to keep their units intact, to not be the one who failed. These voices, drawn from the texture of survivor accounts and wartime letters, remind us that the Demyansk pocket was not a historical abstraction, but a place where individual consciousness persisted, moment by moment, through conditions that should have broken the human spirit entirely. And yet it did not. Or perhaps it did, but the men who experienced it learned to live in their brokenness, to function despite it. The snow continued to fall, the wind continued to blow, and somewhere in the darkness of a frozen forest, men still wrote letters that would never arrive, and still whispered to one another the small encouragements that make survival possible. And so the winter, which had seemed eternal to the men inside the pocket, began at last to release its grip. As February turned toward March in 1942, the temperature fluctuations grew more pronounced, still far below freezing at night, but the days now carried a thin, almost imperceptible warmth that softened the crust of snow by late afternoon. For the trapped divisions, this shift brought not relief, but a new and different torment. The earth beneath the snow, frozen solid for months, began to thaw in shallow layers. Wherever German vehicles had churned the ground, wherever men had trampled paths between the scattered villages and makeshift headquarters, the white landscape transformed into something far more treacherous. A vast, expanding bog of mud and meltwater that swallowed trucks whole and made the movement of supplies, ammunition, and wounded men an exercise in almost unbearable difficulty. The Luftwaffe's aerial resupply, which had been difficult enough in the heart of winter, now faced a new catastrophe. The makeshift airfields where supply planes had been landing, often cleared simply by sweeping snow from frozen ground, became unusable as mudfields. Consider what this meant. Transport planes arriving with precious loads of food, medicine, and ammunition found no solid ground to touch down on. They circled above an increasingly impassable landscape, their pilots radioing back to the operations centers with growing desperation, uncertain whether they could land at all. The Germans were forced to widen these fields, to lay down logs and torn-up pieces of wooden buildings as makeshift runways, efforts that consumed hundreds of man-hours and still often proved insufficient when a plane's wheels broke through and the aircraft became mired, blocking the field for others behind it. The supply situation had been precarious throughout the winter months, but spring introduced a paradox. Conditions seemed, on the surface, to be becoming more navigable for human movement, yet they were becoming worse for the movement of the quantities of material the encircled forces desperately needed. A man could walk across a snowy plain, or struggle through it with snowshoes and determination, but a truck carrying food for thousands of soldiers, could not simply walk, and the Soviet forces surrounding the pocket, far from becoming passive as the weather shifted, were intensifying their assaults on the German airfields themselves. They understood, as clearly as the German command did, that the Luftwaffe's lifeline was the pocket's lifeline, and that to destroy the fields or reduce landing opportunities was to increase the suffering of the encircled troops exponentially. In late March, after months of brutal containment, a decision was made at German Army Group North headquarters that would alter the situation, at least slightly. An attempt would be made to carve open a narrow corridor, a land bridge of controlled territory connecting the pocket to the main German lines to the west. This operation, which history would come to know by the location where it centered, the village of Ramushevo, represented a gamble of enormous stakes. To open such a corridor would require German forces already pressed to their limits to attack outward, while simultaneously the encircled divisions attempted to break outward to meet them, all while Soviet forces gathered their reserves to prevent precisely this from happening. The frozen ground, though it remained hard in the early mornings, was becoming softer, which meant that armor had to move with caution or sink. Infantry could still fight across it, but the mud clung to uniforms, slowed movement, and added to the misery of men already pushed to the edge of their physical endurance. Picture the landscape as spring deepened. Still patches of snow lay in shadowed depressions and beneath the dense pine forests that covered much of the region, but the open ground between villages was transformed. The roads, such as they were, became slavs, where wheeled vehicles moved with maddening slowness. The Totenkopf Division, despite its losses over the winter months, was tasked with a pivotal role in the outward breakout attempt. Theodor Eicke, the division commander, drove his exhausted men forward with the same unrelenting intensity he had demanded throughout the encirclement, understanding that failure meant a return to the grinding starvation and cold of the pocket's interior. The men, thin now and hollow-eyed from months of reduced rations, moved through the mud with their weapons, attacking Soviet positions that were themselves being reinforced with fresh troops and reserves moved down from other sectors of the front. The Ramushevo corridor, when it was finally established in late March and early April, proved to be the narrowest and most fragile of lifelines. At its widest point, it might be several kilometers across, but it was constantly under fire from Soviet artillery positioned on either flank. German supply trucks would drive through this corridor, a journey of perhaps 10 or 15 kilometers, but they drove under the threat of bombardment nearly the entire way. Many never made it through. Others broke down on the muddy road and had to be abandoned or towed out by other vehicles, further jamming the supply line. Yet the very existence of this corridor, however tenuous, changed the calculus of survival. Where the pocket had been entirely dependent on the Luftwaffe, dependent, that is, on the weather, on the availability of transport planes, on the skill of pilots under extreme stress, there now existed the possibility of ground-based resupply, however dangerous and limited. The psychological impact on the trapped soldiers was significant, though not uniformly positive. The knowledge that a connection to the main German lines had been established meant that breakout might be possible, that the pocket need not be indefinitely defended. Yet the corridor remained so precarious that no major evacuation or withdrawal was immediately contemplated. The men who had endured the winter's worst months would have to endure the spring's mud and continued Soviet pressure as well. The division's strength, already depleted by 4 months of siege, continued to erode through late April and into May, though now at a somewhat slower rate. The Luftwaffe sorties continued, but with slightly more supplies arriving through the corridor, the aerial lifeline became somewhat less critical to basic survival, though never irrelevant. As the spring progressed and the thaw continued, the nature of the encirclement itself began subtly to shift. The hard, clear lines of winter, where frozen ground and snow-covered terrain made positions relatively static and defined, gave way to a softer, more fluid situation. Soviet positions themselves became mired in mud. The German divisions in the pocket, though still surrounded and under constant pressure, found that small-scale offensive operations became more feasible. Patrols could move through the forests and across the partially thawed terrain. Local attacks on Soviet positions could be mounted and sometimes succeeded in pushing back the perimeter slightly. The Totenkopf Division engaged in numerous such actions throughout April and May, and while these operations resulted in small territorial gains that meant little in the grand strategic sense, they had psychological value for men who had spent the winter largely defending fixed positions. Yet there remained a haunting uncertainty about what would happen next. The German command harbored hopes that a major relief operation, a grand breakout that would dramatically widen the corridor or even eliminate the encirclement entirely, might still be possible once the ground had firmed up in May. But as the spring progressed, it became clear that the resources for such an operation were not available. The German army, for all its achievements and remaining combat strength, was stretched across a front of staggering length, and the reserves that might have been committed to a major relief effort were needed elsewhere. By late May, it became accepted that the pocket, though partially relieved by the Rameshevo corridor, would not be fully relieved by ground operations. The encirclement would continue, though in its new, somewhat less catastrophic form, until further developments on the broader Eastern Front allowed for a general German withdrawal or repositioning. The mud, paradoxically, became an ally of sorts as May advanced. The deepening thaw created such terrible conditions across the entire region that both German and Soviet operations became increasingly difficult and slow. The front stalled, not so much because of a determined defense or a Soviet decision to pause, but because the terrain itself had become nearly impassable to large-scale maneuver. Supply columns could barely move, infantry advances bogged down, even retreats became exercises in endurance against the landscape. For the moment, in that strange interregnum of spring mud, the pocket stabilized. The men inside it, though still living on reduced rations and still under fire, no longer faced the spectre of starvation that had haunted them through the darkest months of winter. The Luftwaffe continued its flights, now supplemented by the narrow corridor. The siege remained, but its intensity had diminished into something almost sustainable, a grim equilibrium that would persist until the summer campaigns of 1942 drew the German army's attention to new objectives far to the south. What remained of the Totenkopf Division when the pocket finally began to dissolve in the spring thaw of 1942 was, in nearly every measurable way, a hollow version of the force that had entered the cauldron 4 months earlier. The numbers told a story that no propaganda film could quite soften. Of the roughly 14,000 men who had been trapped inside the Demyansk pocket when the Soviet ring closed, something close to 6,000 would never leave it alive. They lay now beneath the mud, as the snow receded, buried in mass graves or scattered across the frozen marshes where the fighting had been fiercest. The division's original combat strength had been shattered so completely that Theodor Eicke, the man who had led them through those impossible months, was eventually removed from command of the unit. He would survive the war, though not for long after it, but in those early months of spring, as the survivors were finally withdrawn from the pocket, he faced a command that bore almost no resemblance to the formation he had brought to that frozen forest. The rebuilding began almost immediately, though it followed a peculiar pattern. The Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS understood that letting such an elite unit, or one that was supposed to be elite anyway, fade entirely would be a propaganda disaster. So instead of disbanding the Totenkopf Division, the High Command funneled new recruits, replacements, and fresh equipment into its ranks. Young men, some of them SS volunteers, others conscripted into the SS as the war deepened and manpower became ever more precious, arrived to fill the gaps. Many of them had not been trained in the concentration camp system, like the original cadre. Many of them were not even German. By the middle years of the war, the Totenkopf would absorb volunteers and conscripts from across occupied Europe. Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, French, Walloons, men who carried different languages and different traditions, but were bound together now by the SS insignia they wore. What had once been a relatively cohesive unit forged in the peculiar brutality of the camp system became something more fractured, though no less dangerous. A question worth sitting with, perhaps, in the quietness. How does an ideology sustain itself when the men who embodied it are gone? And what do the replacements inherit? Belief, or simply uniforms? The division's experience at Demyansk was almost immediately seized upon by German propaganda machinery as proof of something vital. Here, the narrative went, was evidence of German racial superiority, of the unbreakable will of the SS, of devotion that could overcome even nature itself. Newsreels showed officers, including Ike himself, receiving honors and commendations. Photographs were circulated of men emerging from the pocket, gaunt and frostbitten but alive, transformed into symbols of endurance. The story that was told in Berlin and broadcast to the German public was carefully curated. These men had held against overwhelming odds. They had proven that the SS spirit could not be broken. They had demonstrated the reality of the Führer's vision of racial struggle. Left largely unspoken was the waste, the futility of the encirclement itself, the fact that 6 German divisions had been trapped because of a fundamental failure of strategy and overextension. Those uncomfortable truths were buried beneath layers of heroic narrative. And yet, for many of the survivors who had actually lived through those months, the propaganda felt hollow in a way that is difficult to fully convey. When you have buried your comrades in the snow, when you have eaten horse meat that tasted like sawdust, when you have watched men lose their fingers and their toes to frostbite, and then watched them die from infections that the field hospitals could not treat, the official story of glorious endurance does not quite match the reality you have carried inside yourself. There are accounts from the period, letters, memoirs, oral histories collected decades later that suggest a strange dissonance between what was celebrated and what was actually felt by those who had survived. Some men spoke of pride in what they had endured together. Others spoke of the senselessness of it, the way so many lives had been sacrificed for what amounted to a temporary delay in a larger German retreat. Both feelings could exist in the same person, layered over one another, like the winter clothing they had worn. The division was redistributed to other theatres of war, rotated north and south along the vast expanse of the Eastern Front. It saw action near Kharkov, participated in the great tank battles of the Central Front, and was moved westward as the Soviets began their long, grinding advance toward Germany itself. In each of these engagements, the Totenkopf was considered a reliable formation, not always victorious, certainly, but known for holding ground and for fighting with an intensity that sometimes bordered on fanaticism. Whether this intensity came from ideological commitment or simply from the kind of cohesion that forms among men who have survived catastrophe together is perhaps impossible to untangle. The survivors of Demyansk, those who remained in the division after the replacements arrived, carried a kind of weight with them. New men looked to them for guidance and example. Ike's successor, and the successors after that, attempted to recreate something of the original esprit de corps, though in the latter years of the war, as the tide turned decisively against Germany, this became increasingly difficult. The Demyansk pocket itself took on an almost mythic quality in German military memory. It was remembered as a triumph against the odds, a moment when the German military machine had demonstrated its superiority despite being surrounded, despite being starved of supplies, despite the Russian winter itself. But it was also, in retrospect, one of the first major signals that the war in the East was not going to proceed as German strategic planners had imagined. The idea that air power could sustain an entire encircled army, that aircraft alone could keep tens of thousands of men fed and supplied, had been attempted, had been claimed as a success, and would be attempted again under even more disastrous circumstances at Stalingrad just months later. When the Luftwaffe tried to resupply the 6th Army trapped in Stalingrad, they believed they could repeat the feat they had achieved at Demyansk. But Stalingrad would be larger, more desperate, and the Luftwaffe's resources by then would be far more depleted. The pattern established at Demyansk would echo forward, with increasingly tragic consequences. What becomes clear, from a vantage point of historical distance, is that Demyansk was simultaneously a small survival and a vast waste. The German command could point to it and say, "Look, we held a pocket deep in Soviet territory, we maintained discipline and cohesion, we were relieved by relief operations." But the cost, the 6,000 dead, the thousands more wounded and crippled by frostbite, the complete exhaustion of a combat division that had to be rebuilt almost from nothing, this was a cost that Germany, as its manpower grew ever more scarce, could ill afford to pay. The Totenkopf Division, when it emerged from that pocket, was no longer the force it had been. It was a hollow thing filled with new recruits, patched together, pressed into service again, asked to perform miracles with material and men that were increasingly inadequate to the task. There is a peculiar way in which military organizations remember their greatest trials. Sometimes the memory becomes a source of genuine strength and cohesion, a shared understanding of what can be endured. Sometimes it becomes something darker, a justification for the next decision to hold ground at all costs, the next refusal to retreat, even when retreat might preserve the force for another day of fighting. The Totenkopf Division, rebuilt and reshaped as it was, seemed caught between these two currents. Men who had survived Demyansk spoke of it to the replacements. New officers studied what had happened in that pocket. The division's identity became bound up with the narrative of that winter siege, for better and worse. When would they hold a line like they had held that line? When would they demonstrate that same refusal to surrender? These questions hung over the division's subsequent operations, creating a kind of obligation to repeat the sacrifice. By the end of the war, the Totenkopf Division was utterly destroyed. In its final engagements against the Soviets and later against the Western Allies, it ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The men who had survived Demyansk, if any of them made it to the war's end, found themselves scattered, captured, killed, or in some rare cases, somehow making their way back to whatever remained of their homes. The division that Hitler had pinned medals on, that the propaganda ministry had celebrated as proof of SS superiority, simply dissolved into the general wreckage of the German military collapse. The men who had endured that winter siege were, in the end, swallowed up by a much larger catastrophe. And in that context, the triumph of the Demyansk pocket, the careful narrative of it that had been constructed, seemed somehow even more poignant and more tragic. They had survived, yes, but survival had not been enough. Nothing would be enough. In the years that followed Demyansk, military historians in Germany began to study what had happened there with a peculiar mixture of pride and unease. The airlift itself was hailed as a triumph, a demonstration that German logistical ingenuity could overcome what seemed like impossible circumstances. Aircraft had flown through blizzards and enemy fire to sustain an entire army group's worth of men, and most of them had lived to tell the story. By May, when the pocket finally dissolved and the encircled divisions fought their way to relief, the narrative seemed complete. Germany had learned something new about warfare, something that future strategists would remember. But what emerged from more careful examination was far more complex and far more troubling than the official accounts suggested. Historians, working through operational records decades later, began to notice something that wartime propagandists had carefully obscured. The Demyansk airlift, while operationally successful in keeping the trapped forces alive for 4 crucial months, had succeeded only because several conditions had aligned that were unique to that particular moment in the Eastern Front. The Soviet Air Force in that region, though growing stronger, was still relatively weak compared to what it would become. The weather, while savage, had permitted enough clear days for transport aircraft to land and unload supplies. The distances involved, though considerable, were manageable for the Junkers Ju-52 transports, and the occasional Heinkel bomber pressed into service. And perhaps most importantly, the German command structure had been willing to accept truly catastrophic losses among the transport crews. losses that amounted to nearly a quarter of every aircraft committed to the operation. It was, in other words, possible, but only just. Within the high command, certain officers, particularly those who had witnessed the operation firsthand, began to whisper a cautionary note as the war moved forward. They understood, with a clarity that hindsight would only confirm, that this method of sustaining encircled forces was not a reliable solution to be repeated, but rather a dangerous precedent that might tempt commanders to accept encirclements they ought to have prevented entirely. Supply by air was never efficient. It was never sufficient except in the barest minimum sense. It worked at Demyansk because the pocket was relatively small, because the encirclement lasted only 4 months, and because the loss rates among aircraft and crews were simply accepted as the cost of war. But what if, in some future crisis, all those conditions did not align? What if a larger pocket had to be sustained for longer? What if German air superiority was less assured? These questions, whispered in staff meetings and written in the margins of operational diaries, would come to haunt German strategy in the months ahead. By late 1942, the Wehrmacht found itself facing a situation that seemed, on the surface, similar to Demyansk. A German army had been encircled, not by Soviet counterattack, but by the grinding failure of the Sixth Army to capture and hold the city of Stalingrad. In the bitter autumn of 1942, as Soviet pincers closed around General Friedrich Paulus's forces, a debate raged within German high command about whether the encircled army could be sustained by airlift while a relief force fought its way through. It is here that historians have identified a critical divergence. The lessons of Demyansk, rather than serving as a restraining force on German ambition, instead seem to embolden certain commanders, or, more precisely, to offer them a justification for decisions they had already made on other grounds. Hitler, in particular, appears to have seized on the Demyansk precedent as proof that encirclement was survivable, that German air power and logistical will could overcome even the most desperate situations. The Luftwaffe, when asked whether they could supply a much larger force across greater distances in harsher conditions, was pressured to say yes when the honest answer was no. How different might the Eastern Front have been if the memory of Demyansk had instead prompted a complete prohibition against accepting encirclement? The scale of the difference between the two operations is almost difficult to grasp. At Demyansk, roughly 90,000 troops occupied a pocket perhaps 20 kilometers across at its widest point. At Stalingrad, nearly 250,000 men were trapped across a far larger and more fragmented perimeter. At Demyansk, the Luftwaffe ultimately flew around 3,000 transport sorties to keep the pocket supplied. At Stalingrad, they would attempt more than 400 sorties per day for months on end, a logistical requirement that exceeded their capacity by a factor that even the most optimistic planners could not deny. The distance was greater. The weather was worse. Soviet air defenses were infinitely stronger, and the pocket could not be relieved in a matter of months. It would have to be held indefinitely, or until a relief force could break through. What many historians find most poignant about this tragic unfolding is that the warnings were, in fact, voiced. Luftwaffe officers who had managed the Demyansk airlift attempted to explain to their superiors, and through them, to Hitler, that what had worked in 1942 could not possibly work on a vastly larger scale. The mathematics were simply not in their favor. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected combat flyers, attempted to provide a candid assessment. Even optimistic estimates suggested that the Stalingrad pocket could receive no more than 100 tons of supplies per day, when the actual requirement was closer to 700. The gap was not a matter that improved flying or heroic effort could bridge. It was a question of fundamental logistics, of weight and distance and available aircraft, and it admitted no romantic solution. But Hitler was not in the mood for mathematics. Hitler was in the mood for proof that German willpower could overcome material constraints, and so the Demyansk airlift became, in a very real sense, the precedent that enabled the catastrophe of Stalingrad. The fact that something had been accomplished once seemed, to him, to suggest that it could be accomplished again on any scale whatsoever. This is a pattern that repeats throughout military history, the temptation to repeat a successful tactical improvisation as if it were a reliable strategy, the confusion between what is barely possible and what is reliably sustainable. Modern historians studying the Eastern Front have therefore come to view the Demyansk airlift not as an isolated triumph, but as a moment in which a specific set of favorable conditions was mistaken for a general principle. It was, in other words, a success that contained within it the seeds of a far greater failure. The operation itself was conducted with skill and remarkable bravery. The crews who flew those transport aircraft into murderous conditions demonstrated a kind of courage that deserves to be remembered. But the political and strategic interpretation of that success, the idea that it proved air supply was a viable means of sustaining large encircled forces, was a dangerous and ultimately disastrous misreading of what had actually occurred. There is something almost melancholy in recognizing this pattern. Those who remember Demyansk had lived through the experience of being encircled and surviving it. One might have expected that experience to inoculate them against ever accepting such conditions again. But instead, the memory of survival became, for some, a template for further risk. The pocket that was narrowly sustained became proof that pockets could be sustained. And so in the winter of 1942 and into 1943, at Stalingrad, German soldiers found themselves trapped once again in snow and cold, waiting for supplies that would never arrive in sufficient quantities, waiting for relief forces that could never quite break through. The question that haunts historians of this period is simple and unanswerable. What if the Demyansk operation had failed? What if those transport aircraft had not made it through? What if the pocket had been overrun before relief could arrive? Would the disaster of Stalingrad have been prevented by the trauma of such a failure? It is one of those counterfactual moments that illustrates the razor-thin margins upon which history sometimes turns. A handful of successful transport flights, a few clear days of weather, the decision to accept casualties at a level that would have seemed unconscionable just a year earlier. These small contingencies combined to create what seemed like a strategic lesson, when in fact it was merely the outcome of a desperate gamble that had happened to succeed. When the spring thaw finally came to the Demyansk pocket, in the early months of 1942, the landscape transformed in ways both welcome and terrible. The snow that had defined every hour of the siege began to recede, revealing what lay beneath, not relief, but a new and grimmer reality. The frozen earth turned to mud. Supply lines, once precarious even in winter's hard grip, became nearly impassable in the sudden softness of a Russian spring. And yet the Totenkopf Division, though severely reduced, remained trapped. The division that had entered the pocket with nearly 18,000 men was now perhaps a third of that strength. Theodor Eicke himself, the iron disciplinarian who had held the unit together through months of cold and hunger, would not lead his men out. In March, he was transferred north to command a larger SS formation, leaving behind the remnants of the force he had forged. His departure marked a subtle turning point, not in the military sense. The pocket would remain contested and isolated for weeks more, but in the psychological fabric of what had become a legendary unit within the German war machine. The men who had survived the worst winter conditions in modern warfare knew that they had endured something few others had. Whether that knowledge brought solace or only deepened the wounds is a question that surfaces softly in the scattered records and letters that remain. Some soldiers spoke of pride. Others, in quieter moments, spoke only of having lived when so many others had not. The eventual breakout and partial relief came not as a triumphant corridor, but as a gradual, contested widening of a narrow supply lane. By April, German relief forces had managed to open a thin land bridge to the pocket, and over weeks, the most severely wounded and the walking remnants of units were able to begin moving westward. The Totenkopf Division did not march out in formation. It limped, it straggled, it was pulled back in pieces, its cohesion fractured by exhaustion and death. The men who emerged from the pocket were not the fanatical SS formations that had entered it. They were survivors, and survival had changed them in ways that propaganda photographs and official communiques could never fully capture. What became of Eike himself is a thread worth following, for it reveals something about the nature of command and consequence in the Nazi military hierarchy. Promoted and reassigned, he would go on to command the SS Panzer Corps on other sectors of the Eastern Front, eventually falling in combat in 1943 when his aircraft was shot down. He died, in a sense, as he had lived, in absolute commitment to a cause that had no mercy. The soldiers under him would outlive him by years, carrying forward the legacy of Demyansk in ways both celebrated and contested. The Totenkopf Division itself, broken and reformed, would become one of the Waffen-SS's most battle-hardened formations. In the years that followed Demyansk, it was reconstituted with fresh recruits and absorbed into larger command structures. It fought at Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history. It served in Ukraine. It participated in operations that grew increasingly brutal as the war entered its later phases and German prospects dimmed. The Demyansk siege, rather than breaking the unit's will or its fanatical ideology, seemed only to harden both. Men who had survived the snow spoke with authority to those who had not. They had endured the unendurable. What other horrors, they might have asked themselves, could they not endure? Yet the place of Demyansk in the wider history of the Eastern Front is not without irony and shadow. The successful aerial resupply of the pocket, though costly and ultimately only partially effective, gave the German High Command a dangerous confidence in a dangerous idea. If the Luftwaffe could keep an entire division supplied from the air, what might be possible elsewhere? This logic, born in the white silence of Demyansk's winter, would travel south and west and would flower into catastrophe. The encirclement at Stalingrad, occurring just months later that same year, would be greeted with the same assurance that had sustained Demyansk: we can hold, we can be resupplied, we can survive. But Stalingrad was larger, colder, farther from friendly lines, and the Luftwaffe's strength was already beginning to decline. The lessons of Demyansk, learned in blood and frost, were misapplied with fatal consequence. How might the war have unfolded differently if German commanders had drawn the harder lesson from Demyansk? Not that encirclement was survivable, but that it was barely survivable, and only at enormous cost. It is one of history's quieter counterfactuals, worth considering not because it changes what happened, but because it illuminates the thinking of men who faced unprecedented choices in unprecedented circumstances. The pocket in the snow had been a warning, written in frostbite and starvation. But warnings, history often shows us, are easier to ignore than to heed. The men of the Totenkopf Division who lived through Demyansk carried the experience forward in ways both psychological and practical. They became instructors for newer units. They became veterans whose judgment was sought in planning operations. They became, in many cases, harder men, less prone to doubt, more convinced of their own resilience and their cause. Some, after the war, would speak of Demyansk in memoirs and interviews with a kind of weariness that suggested the experience had indeed changed them, though perhaps not in the direction that might have been hoped. Others said little, or said nothing at all, preferring to let the snow and silence of that winter remain undisturbed in memory. The historical reassessment of the Demyansk pocket has deepened over the decades since 1945. Military historians and strategists have examined it from every angle: the logistical miscalculations that led to the encirclement, the desperate resourcefulness that kept the pocket supplied, the human cost that was paid in flesh and bone and frozen tears. What emerges is not a simple narrative of heroic endurance or strategic failure, but a complex tableau of human beings trapped in circumstances of their own and their nation's making, responding with courage and suffering in equal measure. The Totenkopf Division's role in Demyansk is neither glorified nor erased in serious historical accounts. It is remembered as a moment of intense military struggle in which men who believed themselves part of an elite formation were tested to their absolute limits and beyond. And so the pocket, in the way of all historical events, became something neither its participants nor its planners quite understood while it was happening. It became a reference point, it became a symbol, it became, in German memory and in the memory of those who fought against Germany, a particular kind of winter siege, not the first, not the last, but one that resonated because of what came after it. The divisions that emerged from Demyansk carried that year into the remaining years of the war. They fought other battles, endured other winters, suffered other defeats, but Demyansk, in a sense, had been their initiation into the deepest kind of military suffering. Everything that followed moved in the long shadow that winter siege cast across the Eastern Front and across the consciousness of everyone it touched. The forests around Demyansk in winter today are largely unchanged. Snow still falls in those same patterns across the Valdai hills. The same wind still moves through the birch and pine, and the lakes still freeze beneath the weight of the season. If you were to stand in that landscape now, in the quiet months between December and March, you might feel something of what those men felt. Not the terror, not the hunger, but the profound silence that snow imposes on a place. The sound-dampening quality of winter is real, almost physical. It presses down, it makes you smaller. The pocket itself, that geographical wound in the Eastern Front, has long since healed. The Rameshevo corridor, where men bled and froze, where trucks and horse-drawn sleighs struggled through mud and snow to deliver their meager cargo, that passage no longer exists, except in maps and photographs, and in the testimonies of those few who lived through it and found the words to describe what they saw. The villages around the perimeter, Demyansk itself, Vyshegda, Selishchi, they have been rebuilt, repopulated, absorbed back into the rhythms of Russian life. Time has done what time does, and yet there is a peculiar quality to places where many people died. Not haunting, exactly, in any supernatural sense, but a kind of gravitational weight to the geography itself. Historians and researchers who have visited those forests speak of a quietness that seems deeper than ordinary winter silence. They describe standing in snow and feeling the presence of accumulated suffering, as if the ground itself remembers. Whether this is psychological, the mind filling in meaning, or something more subtle in how a landscape holds history, is perhaps impossible to say. But the feeling persists in the accounts. What is certain is that forgetting is easier than remembering. The winter of 1942 at Demyansk has faded from popular consciousness in ways that other, perhaps larger battles have not. Stalingrad remains vivid in the Western imagination. Kursk has its historiographical monument. But Demyansk, the airlift that saved 100,000 men at terrible cost, the division that was mauled and reformed and mauled again, this has become something closer to a specialist's knowledge. Young people learning about the Second World War for the first time might know the outline, might read a paragraph or watch a few minutes of footage, but the weight of what happened there, the daily, grinding accumulation of cold and hunger and death, this is harder to convey, harder to hold in the mind. Perhaps that is partly because the story is so morally complicated. The men who died in that pocket were victims of encirclement, victims of the cold, victims of poor strategy and overextension, and yet many of them were also participants in one of history's greatest crimes. The Totenkopf Division, in particular, carried with it the DNA of the concentration camp system. Many of its officers had served as guards in Dachau and Sachsenhausen. The racial ideology that animated its fighting spirit was inseparable from the ideology of extermination. To sympathize with the suffering of its soldiers is not to forgive the system they served or the atrocities they committed. History often refuses to offer us clean moral positions. The survivors of Demyansk, on both sides, carried that moral weight with them. For the Germans, the pocket became an emblem of sacrifice, of holding the line, of faith in final victory. Theodor Eicke himself would speak of Demyansk in propagandistic terms, as evidence of German superiority and German will. Yet Eicke died in 1943, shot down while flying in a light aircraft over Soviet territory. The division survived him, was rebuilt, and fought on until the final collapse. Some of its officers would face war crimes trials. Others would disappear into the post-war years and live ordinary lives in the new Germany. The weight of history distributes itself unevenly. For the Soviet soldiers who fought to contain the pocket and ultimately to relieve it, the experience left different kinds of scars. They had suffered their own immense casualties, their own frostbite and starvation, their own sense of isolation, in a vast, indifferent landscape. Soviet losses on the Eastern Front dwarfed German losses. The mathematics of their suffering were almost incomprehensibly large, and yet their perspective, their memory of Demyansk, remained largely confined to Soviet archives and Soviet consciousness. In the West, the story was filtered through German eyes, told often by German officers writing memoirs after the war. This imbalance in remembrance, the Western tendency to center the German experience, to give voice to the German archives, to make the German perspective the default, this too is part of what happened at Demyansk. The snow falls equally on all graves, but memory does not. And yet something worth preserving exists in the very fact of Demyansk. Not the ideology, not the commitment to a monstrous regime, but the plain human reality of endurance. Men, whatever their ideological commitments, whatever crimes their state was committing, still had to wake in the morning in temperatures that froze human flesh in minutes. They still had to choose, moment by moment, whether to go on or to surrender to the cold. They still felt fear and hunger and the desire to survive. They still wrote letters home that were never sent. They still made jokes to survive the psychological weight of isolation. They still helped their comrades when they could, though helping often meant sharing a slightly larger portion of a ration that was itself too small to sustain life. This is not an argument for sympathy with Nazism or with the perpetrators of the Holocaust. It is simply an observation about the way human beings behave when faced with extremity. We are capable of astonishing cruelty, and we are capable of astonishing solidarity and resilience. Both things are true. Both things happened at Demyansk. The historical importance of Demyansk has perhaps less to do with the battle itself than with what it represented for the future. The successful airlift of supplies into an encircled pocket, albeit at tremendous cost, suggested to German military planners that similar operations might be possible in the future. This was a kind of dangerous hope. When the Sixth Army was encircled at Stalingrad in November 1942, less than a year after Demyansk, German military leadership looked back at the earlier pocket and imagined that Stalingrad too could be held, that supplies could be flown in, that relief could be achieved. This hope proved catastrophic. The scale was different. The Luftwaffe was weaker, Soviet air defenses were stronger, and the lesson of Demyansk was misread, or perhaps misapplied too eagerly. The encirclement at Demyansk had been a close thing, a survival that required luck as well as courage. At Stalingrad, luck ran out. In this way, Demyansk became what historians sometimes call a false precedent, an example that seems to prove something about what is possible, but which actually depended on contingencies that did not repeat. We often learn the wrong lessons from history. We see one outcome and assume its causes are replicable. We forget how much depends on timing and chance, on whether a supply column arrives on the right day, whether a defensive line holds for precisely long enough, whether the enemy makes one mistake rather than another. The fields around Demyansk are quiet now. In the satellite imagery of the landscape, you can see the scars of conflict if you know where to look. Areas where trees are younger than they should be, a dearth of vegetation suggesting heavy use, patterns in the terrain that military engineers would recognize as fortifications. But to the casual observer, to someone walking through those forests, it is simply Russian landscape. It is beautiful in the way that Russian winter landscape often is, with a kind of austere, mineral quality to the light and the sky. If you stand there, if such a thing were possible, and it is possible, one can visit these places, you might think about what it means to endure, about the way the human body continues to function even when it is cold enough that flesh begins to die. about the way the human mind continues to generate hope even when reason suggests there is none, about the way communities, even in the worst circumstances, even committed to the most abhorrent causes, still function according to the rhythms of human kindness and human need. The snow falls on those fields still. It muffles sound the way it muffled the sounds of artillery fire and aircraft engines and the voices of dying men. It covers the ground with its white silence, erasing what lies beneath, making the landscape blank and unknowable. And yet beneath that surface, the memory persists, not in any supernatural way,